Deep night over the Wyoming Territory. Cold wind off the ridges carries the sharp chemical scent of coal oil wrong in a way wood smoke never is. Flame erupts from the corner of the horse barn. Horses scream into the dark. Dry September hay burns like powder. A figure vanishes into the night, leaving a dark trail of oil on the dry timber wall. Inside, a young man wakes, choking on thick smoke. He stumbles out, hauling at the corral gate. A section of loft collapses without warning. A burning beam drives into his shoulder. The sound of bone breaking is dry and final. He goes down hard in the dirt. Hands seize his collar. Drag him clear of the fire that is swallowing everything. The train was 11 minutes late into Larkspur Junction. Nobody on the platform thought that was strange. The Cheyenne line ran 11 minutes late on a good day. Sometimes 20. Once, in a blizzard the winter before, 6 hours, and half the town had come out anyway, just to stand around and complain about it together, because that's what small towns do with an excuse. September 1879. The sky over the Wyoming Territory had gone that pale bruised yellow it turns before the first real cold snap. Caleb Thorne stood at the far end of the platform, with his hat pulled low and his hands jammed in his coat pockets, and his mind was already 3 miles north, walking a fence line he didn't have the wire to build. 60 rolls of barbed wire. 40 cedar posts, milled, not rough cut. A stock tank, if the freight price came in fair. He'd run the list in his head so many times that morning it had stopped being a list and started being something closer to a prayer. He didn't watch the horizon the way the other men on the platform watched it. Not eager, not hopeful. He watched the ground instead, because the ground didn't ask questions. The ground didn't have opinions about a 38-year-old rancher who still ate supper alone most nights and hadn't danced at a social in going on 4 years. Wendell Pruitt had an opinion, though. Ran the Mercantile. Had an opinion on every subject known to man, a handful that weren't known to anyone because he'd invented them himself out of pure boredom. Bet you it's machine parts, Pruitt said, loud enough to carry. Somebody ordered a thresher. Big crate. You watch. Nobody watched. Nobody answered him either. That never once stopped Wendell Pruitt from talking. The whistle came up the canyon first. Thin, far off. Then the engine itself grinding closer, swallowing every other sound on the platform until it was just noise and steam and the long shriek of the brakes, then stillness, the tick of cooling iron, the murmur of people gathering themselves to move. A freight handler dropped the ramp. A boy jumped off first, 14 maybe, running toward something important only to himself. Then a drummer in a checked coat sample case swinging at his side. Then nothing, for a beat. And Caleb had already turned toward the freight car at the rear, the one that should have held his wire, when a voice stopped him cold. Mr. Thorne? He turned. She was standing there like she'd stepped straight out of the steam itself and hadn't quite decided to leave it behind. Tall, straight-backed in a way you noticed because most people slump some after 4 hours on a hard bench. Somewhere in her 40s. Gray threading through dark hair, pinned tight beneath a modest hat. A traveling dress that had been fine once and was still cared for now. The particular care of a woman who mends instead of replaces. A small bag over one arm, and behind her, a porter set down a single weathered trunk harder than he needed to, the way men set down things they've already decided don't matter. Yes, Caleb said, because that much was true at least. He was Mr. Thorne. Odessa Vance. She didn't offer her hand. I was told there was an arrangement. A pause. He watched her decide to just say the rest of it plainly instead of dressing it up any further. A marriage arrangement. Through the Larkspur agency. The word landed and sat there. Marriage. Something unpleasant moved through Caleb's stomach. Ma'am, I didn't place any order with a marriage agency. His hands came out of his pockets like that would help. It didn't. I placed a supply order. Wire cedar posts. From the outfitters in Chalmers Bend. Not he stopped. Because something had crossed her face. Not embarrassment exactly. Something older than embarrassment. The stillness of a person who's absorbed so many bad surprises in her life that a new one doesn't even register as new anymore. It just goes in the file with all the others. I see, she said. 2 words. Flat as a closed door. Inside, though. Inside was a different matter entirely, because inside something had started shaking loose the moment the porter set that trunk down. A voice, small and mean and entirely too familiar, the one that had been whispering at her off and on, for 3 straight years now, ever since a February morning in a Kansas pasture. See, told you exactly what you are, and here's a stranger confirming it in writing, in a man's careful block letters, tied with string like a parcel nobody wanted delivered. Stop it, she told herself. And then, because telling herself to stop rarely worked any better than it had the last 3 years, she tried again harder. Stop it, Odessa. You are 44 years old. You have buried a husband and built a herd from nothing twice over, and you did not travel 400 miles on a hard bench seat to apart on a train platform in front of a man named Wendell Pruitt, except her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, except her ears were ringing faintly, that thin, high sound that always came just before tears. She had no intention of letting anyone hear witness, so she held still instead, held her spine straight, the way her own mother had taught her decades ago a lady did slump. Odessa, whatever the room is doing to her, and she let the ringing pass, and she let the cold in her hands stay cold, because cold hands were a private matter and nobody on that platform needed to know about them. Wendell Pruitt had drifted close enough now to hear every word of it, and wasn't even pretending otherwise. He leaned toward Curtis Iverson from the livery and said something low. Iverson laughed. Not a big laugh, just enough. Caleb heard it. Watched Odessa hear it too. Watched the small, precise tightening at the corner of her jaw. And something in him, he didn't examine it too closely, not standing there with an audience, went hard and cold at once. Pointed at two men he'd known his whole life and had never once wanted to strike until this exact moment. He looked past her at the trunk. There was a tag on it. Brown paper, looped through the handle with a length of twine. He couldn't read it from where he stood. So he crossed the distance and read it, and Odessa didn't move to stop him, didn't say a word, just watched him with an expression that had already guessed his reaction and was bracing for it. Worthless. Not stamped. Not printed. Written by hand, in clean block letters, the kind of letters a man forms when he has all the time in the world and no fear whatsoever of being wrong. Deliberate. Someone sat down somewhere with a pen and decided calmly to write that single word and tie it to a woman's belongings before she'd ever climbed aboard a train. Caleb's ears went hot. Who wrote this? Not really a question flatter than that. The agency said the arrangement came through a third party. Her voice stayed level. Too level. The voice of someone who has practiced staying calm because the alternative has never once gotten her anywhere. They wouldn't give a name. Pruitt was close enough now that Caleb didn't need to strain to hear him. 50 if she's a day, Pruitt said, not troubling to lower his voice at all. Somebody's idea of a joke, shipping that out to Broken Spur. Thorne's luck just keeps on getting better. A woman near them, Iverson's wife, Caleb thought, though he didn't turn to check, put a gloved hand over her mouth. Not from sympathy. From something a good deal closer to delight. Caleb reached down and untied the tag from the trunk handle. His fingers weren't gentle about it. He folded the paper once, sharp crease, and put it in his coat pocket, and he did not look at Wendell Pruitt while he did it, because he wasn't entirely sure what his own face would do if he did. The next train east leaves Thursday morning, he said to Odessa. I'll see you get a room at the boarding house till then. Fares covered. Whatever it costs. He paused. Made himself finish the offer, because fare mattered more to him than fast. Or you can ride out to the ranch. Take a look at it. Decide for yourself what you think. Either way, it's your choice. Nobody else is making it for you today. I have $40. She said, not quite an answer, more a fact she needed said aloud before she could think past it. That's the whole of what I own outright, besides the trunk. I mention it only so you understand exactly what kind of choice you're offering. I don't have the means to be proud about it. She looked at him for a long moment, not undecided exactly. He would come to understand, much later, that Odessa Vance rarely looked undecided even in the moments she genuinely was, because deciding out loud where people could watch her do it had never once been a habit that served her well. What she was doing, standing there with steam still curling around her skirts and half the platform pretending not to stare, was running some private ledger behind her eyes, weighing one column against another. She looked once at the gathered crowd, at Pruitt, arms crossed like a man who'd already won an argument nobody else was having, at Iverson's wife, hands still half over her mouth, at the freight handler who had entirely stopped moving crates, because apparently this was better entertainment than his actual job. Then she looked back at Caleb. And here was the strange part, the part she wouldn't fully understand until much later, lying awake on a strange cot in a strange house, trying to name what had tipped the scale, because it wasn't kindness exactly that decided her. She'd been offered kindness before, in the months right after Elijah died, casseroles left on porches, murmured condolences from women who meant well and had no earthly idea what to do with a widow who refused to cry where anyone could see it. Kindness alone had never once been enough to move her. It was the tag, the folding of it, the way he hadn't smoothed it flat and studied it and handed it back to her with an apology dressed up as pity. He'd folded it once, sharp, and put it away in his own pocket, like it was evidence of something, like it belonged to him now as much as to her, a debt he intended to keep track of, which meant something. She wasn't yet sure what, but something worth 400 more feet of unfamiliar road at least. Something worth one afternoon's ride to go and see for herself, the way she'd always insisted on seeing things for herself. Whatever the cost of the looking turned out to be. "I'll ride out," she said. The wagon was not built for company. Caleb hadn't apologized for the crack down the middle of the bench seat in longer than he could remember, the one he'd patched 2 winters back with a strip of leather nailed down flat, and never gotten around to fixing properly since. He didn't apologize for it now, either. He'd stopped apologizing for the state of things around the ranch somewhere in the last 3 years, because the list of things that wanted an apology had gotten so long, it had quietly stopped being a list and started being a description of his entire life. They rode north out of Larkspur without much talk. The road climbed slow through sage and yellowed grass, the mountains sitting blue and enormous at the far edge of everything, indifferent, the way mountains always are, to whatever's happening at their feet. Odessa sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine straight even on the low bad side of the bench. She didn't speak for the better part of 20 minutes then. "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years. "Cattle operation?" "Yes." "How many head?" He glanced sideways at her. "Why do you ask?" "Because you were standing on that platform thinking about fence wire, not about a bride. Which tells me you've got animals getting where they shouldn't. I'd like to understand what sort of operation I nearly married into by accident." A pause, dry as the road dust. "Before I decide whether it was a fortunate accident or an unfortunate one." Caleb almost smiled. Didn't quite let himself. 81 head, he said, down from 110 last spring. She didn't answer that direct, just nodded once, the way a person nods when filing a fact away for later use, and he noticed the nod, the economy of it, and thought, briefly, and without meaning to that, she wasted very little in the way she moved. "My husband and I ran an operation for 22 years. Weather report. Not proud. Not sad. Fact, in Kansas. We sold it after he passed. I didn't want to run it alone, and his brother wanted to buy it, so that seemed the sensible arrangement." "How long ago?" "Going on 4 years now." "A beat. Long enough that I've stopped counting it in months. Not long enough that I've stopped counting it at all." He didn't ask anything further. He'd carried enough grief of his own, in his own particular shape, to recognize when a person had said exactly as much as they intended and not one word more. The quiet that followed wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised him more than it should have. Because he'd been alone in this wagon, on this road, for 11 years, and he could not remember the last time silence beside him had felt like company instead of like an empty seat. "You're wondering about me too," she said, out of nowhere, not turning her head. Didn't say a word. "You didn't have to." Men get a particular look on their faces when they're deciding whether to ask a personal question. She glanced at him sideways. "You've had that look for the last mile." Caleb felt his neck go warm, which was a fairly ridiculous thing for a grown man to experience over a wagon full of nothing but road dust, and honesty wasn't going to ask. Ask, why's a woman with 22 years experience running cattle need a marriage agency at all? Something flickered behind her eyes. Gone before he could name it. "I didn't need one," she said. "I never signed with one. I don't know how my name came to be on their list. That's the part that troubles me more than the rest of it, if I'm honest." A beat. "Somebody put me there on purpose." Caleb turned that over. "Any notion who?" "None." Which was true, though even as she said it, she felt something small and cold shift in her chest, the way a person feels a draft before they've located the open window causing it. "I've made very few enemies in my life, Mr. Thorne. I've made a great many acquaintances who found me difficult, which isn't the same thing. Difficult women don't usually inspire this particular kind of trouble. They inspire gossip." Not she gestured vaguely at herself, at the road, at the whole absurd shape of the last 2 days this. "Maybe it wasn't about you at all," Caleb said. "Maybe it was about me. Somebody wanting to see broken spur fold and figuring a scandal might do the job faster than a bad winter." "Maybe," Odessa said. But she didn't sound convinced, and Caleb noticed that too, filed it away the way he was starting to file away a great many small things about the woman riding beside him. The road bent north, and the valley opened up ahead of them, the 2 long ridgelines rising pale gold in the last of the afternoon light. and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Just watched the country unfold, the way country does when a person's about to see it for the first time and doesn't yet know whether it's going to be home. It's beautiful, Odessa said, quiet, almost to herself. Different than Kansas. Kansas is flat as a griddle for 200 miles in every direction. You forget what a hill looks like, living there long enough. She studied the ridgeline like she was memorizing it, in case she needed to describe it to someone later, or in case she needed to hold on to it herself. This is different. This has some opinion about itself. Caleb almost laughed. Never heard land described that way before. Most people don't look at land long enough to notice it has one. Broken Spur sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, which was where the ranch got its name, though Caleb had never much cared for the name, because the North Ridge wasn't any more impressive than the South one, and the logic of it had bothered him in some small, unimportant way for 11 straight years. The house was solid. 4-room, local timber, chinked and weathered, but sound. The barn was bigger than the house, which was correct, because a barn ought to be bigger than a house on any working operation, and a rancher who told you different was either lying or broke, and often both at once. 3 men were sitting on the bunkhouse steps when the wagon rolled in, and all 3 stood the moment they saw who was riding beside their boss. Ambrose Tate was the oldest, near 40, with a face that looked like it had spent 30 years standing directly in front of weather and had made a kind of peace with it. He'd worked Broken Spur 6 years and had, in Caleb's memory, never once said more words in a day than were strictly necessary to get the job done. Micah Sutter was 24, quick with horses. Quiet with people, not slow, careful, though strangers rarely made that distinction on first meeting him. Jubal Reed was the youngest. Showed up that spring looking for work, and Caleb had simply never gotten around to telling him to move along, which was about as close as Jubal was ever going to get to a formal hiring letter. All 3 looked at Odessa the particular way a person looks at something they were not expecting to see climb down off a wagon. "Boys," Caleb said, swinging down, "this is Mrs. Vance. She'll be staying a few days." Ambrose straightened. He caught himself, which was probably wise. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Micah said nothing. From Micah, that wasn't rudeness. That was simply Micah. Jubal said howdy and studied his own boots like they'd suddenly grown fascinating. Caleb carried the trunk inside himself and set it in the spare room, cot, a window facing east, a small table with a wobble in one leg he'd been meaning to fix for going on 2 years. "It's not much," he said. "It's fine." Flat again. He was starting to understand that this was simply how she talked about most things, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't mind it. Found it almost restful, after years in a house that had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like an unfilled room. He showed her the water pump, the privy, where the kitchen kept its stores. Supper that first evening was, by anyone's honest measure, a disaster. Caleb had cooked for himself in 3 hands for 11 years, which meant he'd gotten competent at quantity, and never once troubled himself with quality. Beans gone soft to the point of surrender. Salt pork burned along one edge and raw along the other, a feat only a man badly distracted by a stranger in his kitchen could have managed. Biscuits that Jubal, tactfully, described as solid, which was one word for it. Odessa ate hers without comment. Ambrose ate his the way he ate everything, without apparent opinion one way or the other. Micah pushed his around the plate, more than he ate it. Jubal, who had considerably less tact than survival instinct, took one bite of the biscuit and set it down like it had personally wronged him. "Something the matter, Mr. Reed?" Odessa asked, not looking up from her own plate. "No, ma'am." Jubal picked the biscuit back up guiltily. "Fine biscuit." "It is not," Odessa said. "Mild as Sunday weather, a fine biscuit. Wall. It is a serviceable biscuit that has clearly suffered for want of a woman's hand, or frankly anyone's hand that's made bread more than 4 times in a decade." She glanced at Caleb, and there was something almost mischievous in it, the first crack of humor he'd seen from her since the platform. "No offense intended, Mr. Thorne. None taken," Caleb said, though his ears had gone a little warm. "I never claimed to be a cook." "No," she agreed. "You did not, which I respect considerably more than I would respect a man who claimed it and served me this." Ambrose made a sound that might, in a man less economical with his reactions, have qualified as a laugh. Micah grinned down at his plate. Jubal set the biscuit down again, more confidently this time, clearly having decided its fate was sealed regardless of his opinion on the matter. "I could take over the cooking," Odessa said, "while I'm here, if that would be welcome." Four men looked at her with an expression so uniformly hopeful it was, Caleb thought, faintly comical. Ma'am Ambrose said, with the gravity of a man accepting a peace treaty, that would be very welcome. She took it in without comment, the same steady attention she'd given the road, and then, once the supper dishes were cleared, she asked if she might walk out to the pasture before the light went. What for, he said. I'd like to see the herd. He shrugged. Suit yourself. She went alone. He watched from the kitchen window as she crossed to the fence line and stood there a long while in the last of the light, just looking, the way a person looks at a letter they're not certain, yet, whether they want to open. In the spare room, later, Odessa sat on the edge of the cot with her boots still on and looked at the trunk she hadn't yet unpacked. She hadn't cried on the train, hadn't cried at the station, not with Pruitt and his laughing friend standing close enough to feed on it. She wasn't going to start now, in a stranger's house, on a cot that creaked when she shifted her weight. Except the tag was gone from the trunk now, folded up somewhere in a rancher's coat pocket, and she found she couldn't stop thinking about it. About the fact that a man she'd never met, never once laid eyes on, had sat down somewhere with a pen and decided with great and careful patience exactly what word to use. Not cheap, not unwanted. Worthless. He'd chosen that word the way a man chooses a knife. Deliberately, for the particular damage it could do. She unpacked slowly. A second dress, worn soft at the seam. A small tin of salve her husband had taught her to mix, years back, from things that grew wild along the creek bottoms. In cans, a folded letter from her sister that she hadn't opened in 8 months because she already knew what it would say. Roughly, in outline, the way you know the shape of a scolding before you've read the words. A photograph small, in a tin frame, Elijah, younger than he'd been when he died, squinting into a sun that no longer existed anywhere except in that one square of paper. She set the photograph on the wobbling table, straightened it again. Then she went to the window, because the window faced east, and east was where the sun would come up in the morning, and there was something in that fact she needed to hold on to tonight more than she needed sleep. Somewhere out past the glass, a rancher who barely knew her had folded a cruel word into his own coat pocket instead of leaving it lying on the platform where it belonged. She didn't know yet what to make of that. She only knew. It was the first thing in 3 years that had made her want to stay somewhere long enough to find out. She was up before he was. That was the first thing Caleb noticed the next morning, coming into the kitchen half asleep and finding her already at the table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of paper, a cup of coffee near her elbow she'd made herself because she'd found the stove and worked it out without being shown. What's that? He said. Notes. From last evening. She turned the paper toward him. He sat and looked. Small, compact handwriting, entirely legible, which was more than he could say about his own ledgers on his best day. A list. Observations on the herd, on the rotation of the east pasture, the condition of specific animals identified by sight after one evening's walk, a question about the feeding schedule, and near the bottom, a note about a section of fence down by the creek that looked compromised, before he'd even mentioned the north pasture, trouble that had been gnawing at him for 2 full weeks. You got all this in one evening. Some things are easier to see when you haven't been staring at them every single day. She lifted her coffee. You stop seeing a thing after a while, not from carelessness, just because it becomes part of the furniture of your own life, and furniture doesn't get looked at. The note about the feeding schedule was right. He'd known something was off there and hadn't been able to name the shape of it. The creek fence, he said. I didn't know that was going. Ground soft down there. 2 posts are barely holding. Get a hard freeze before you tend it, and you'll spend a cold morning chasing cattle out of the creek bottom instead of doing anything useful with your time. He folded the paper carefully, set it down the way a man sets down, something he isn't yet sure how much he values. The supplies I was expecting on yesterday's train never came, he said. I noticed there was no freight. A beat what happened. Don't know yet. Which was true, and which sat wrong in his chest through the whole of breakfast. Because he had a feeling, the particular feeling a man gets when bad luck starts arriving in a pattern instead of by accident, that not knowing wasn't going to last much longer. That night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house had settled into the same quiet Caleb had lived inside for 11 years, Odessa found him on the porch sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and his eyes on the dark shape of the mountains. You don't sleep much either, she said, not quite a question. Never had much use for it. He shifted over to make room, and she sat, careful of the low crack in the boards that had been threatening to give way since spring. Used to think that'd change once I had a wife to keep me honest about it. Never got around to that part. Never married. Came close once. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, not drinking it. Girl named Sarah Whitlow out of Cheyenne. We were set to marry the spring my father died. I put it off a season to see the ranch through, and by the time I came up for air, she'd married a man who didn't ask her to wait on anything. He said it without much weight to it, the way a person recounts an old bruise that stopped hurting but never quite faded from the skin. Told myself I'd get around to it again someday. 11 years is a long someday. Do you regret it? The waiting. He thought about that honestly. The way she'd noticed, he thought about most things she asked him. No, he said finally, regret the manner of losing her, not the reason for it. This ranch was my father's, and his father's before that, and there wasn't anybody else standing in line to keep it going. I made a choice. Cost me something. Most choices worth making do. Odessa was quiet a moment, looking out at the same dark shape of mountain he'd been watching. Elijah used to say something close to that, she said. That a man who never pays for anything he wants probably didn't want it badly enough to begin with. Sounds like he was worth listening to. He was. A small pause. So was I most days, though he'd have argued I'd always take my own advice. Caleb almost smiled at that. Doesn't sound like a flaw to me. It isn't. Not always. She pulled her coat tighter against the cooling air. Sometimes it's the only thing that gets a person through a year they didn't think they'd survive. They sat there a while longer without talking, the wind moving low through the grass below the porch. The house behind them settled and dark, and Caleb found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, though he wasn't yet ready to examine why it kept happening, that 11 years of quiet evenings on this porch had never once felt like company until 11 days ago. He didn't say that out loud. Some things wanted more time before they were ready to be spoken. What he also didn't say that night, or for several nights after, was the other reason that fence order had mattered so badly it had kept him up, nights before Odessa Vance had ever stepped off any train. The ledger sat in the bottom drawer of his father's old desk, and Caleb pulled it out again after she'd gone up to bed, the way he did most nights when sleep wasn't coming easy, and looked at numbers he already knew by heart and didn't feel any better for reviewing. Broken Spur carried a note with the bank in Chalmers Bend. Had carried it since a bad winter 4 years back had cost him nearly a third of his herd in a single hard freeze, the kind of loss a smaller operation simply didn't recover from without borrowing against next year's hope. He'd been chipping away at that note ever since. A little each season, and this year, with the fence finally closing the gaps that had been bleeding calves off the property line for 2 seasons running, with the herd finally in a position to sell strong at the autumn auction. This year was supposed to be the one where he got properly ahead of it for the first time since his father's funeral. Without the fence, the losses would keep bleeding. Without a strong showing at auction, the note would roll over into another hard winter, and another after that, and Caleb had done that particular arithmetic often enough to know exactly how an operation slid from struggling into gone. Not all at once. Never all at once. Just one bad season stacked on another until the bank stopped extending teens and started extending paperwork instead. He hadn't told Odessa any of it yet. Hadn't told the hands either, though he suspected Ambrose had worked out the shape of it on his own some time back, the way Ambrose worked out most things without needing to be told directly. He closed the ledger, sat a moment longer in the dark kitchen with his hand flat on the cover, the way a man rests his hand on something he's not yet ready to put fully away. Coldwell didn't know about the note. Or maybe he did, maybe. That was exactly why the timing of the canceled order felt so precisely, deliberately cruel. Arriving right at the one season Broken Spur could least afford to lose ground. Caleb couldn't prove it either way, but he'd learned enough about the man in one single conversation at the Mercantile to believe he was entirely capable of that particular kind of patience. The kind that studies a man's weak season for years before deciding exactly when to press. He banked the fire, went up to bed, and lay there a long while listening to the wind move down off the ridge, doing the same arithmetic he always did on nights like this, except tonight, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, the arithmetic didn't feel quite so much like something he was doing alone. 3 days folded into each other, and none of them felt like they were building toward anything in particular. That was the strange part, looking back on it later. They just felt like days, small, ordinary, filled with work. Except they weren't ordinary at all. Something was shifting so slowly that nobody at Broken Spur noticed it happening until it had already happened. Odessa worked. That was the plainest way to say it. She wasn't performing usefulness for anyone's benefit. Wasn't trying to win Ambrose over, or Micah, or Jubal, or Caleb. She worked the way a person works when labor is simply what fills the hours and the hours need filling, and standing around waiting for someone else to hand her a sense of her own worth had stopped being an option she was willing to entertain some years back. On the fourth morning, one of the calves went down in the east pen. Micah found it first, called out across the yard, and by the time Caleb got there, Odessa was already crouched in the mud beside the animal, with her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, one hand pressed flat against its flank, feeling for something. "What's wrong with it?" Caleb said. "Bloat, maybe. Or colic. Give me a minute before you decide it's either." Her voice had gone entirely steady, entirely businesslike, none of the careful flatness from the train platform anywhere in it now. "Micah, fetch me the baking soda from the kitchen. And a length of hose if you've got rubber tubing anywhere in that barn." Micah didn't ask why, just ran. Ambrose crouched down on the other side of the calf, watching her hands. "You done this before. More times than I'd like to count." She pressed along the animal's belly, listening for something none of the rest of them could hear. "It's bloat. Gas built up and can't pass. If we don't relieve it soon, it'll press on the lungs and the heart both. And there won't be any saving it." "How do we relieve it?" Caleb said. "Carefully," she said, which was not entirely reassuring, and also entirely true. Micah came back at a dead run with the soda and a coil of tubing, and for the next 20 minutes, Caleb watched Odessa Vance work with a calm, unhurried precision that made every man standing around her feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely useful simply by handing her what she asked for when she asked for it. She talked to the calf the whole time. Low, steady, not sentimental about it. Just a voice moving through the animal's fear the way water moves around a stone. When the gas finally released a long, low, undignified sound that made Jubal, who'd arrived halfway through, snort out a laugh before catching himself. The calf's breathing eased almost immediately, and its eyes, which had gone glassy with panic, came back into focus. Odessa sat back on her heels in the mud and let out a breath of her own. "It'll live," she said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Ambrose looked at the calf, then at Odessa, then briefly at Caleb, in a way that carried more meaning than any sentence Ambrose Tate had spoken in the last 6 years combined. Ambrose said, finally, I'll bring your coffee out to the fence line mornings, save you the walk." It wasn't much of a thing to say, but from Ambrose, it was practically a proclamation, and Odessa seemed to understand that, because something in her face eased too, just slightly, the way ice eases before it breaks apart entirely. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Tate." That same evening, after the calf had been checked twice more and pronounced steady, Micah found Odessa at the corral fence, watching the horses settle for the night. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned on the rail beside her, the way young men do when they've got a question sitting in their chest, and haven't worked up the nerve to let it out yet. "You always know what to do," he said finally, "like just now. With the calf." "Not always." She kept her eyes on the horses. "Sometimes I guess and get lucky. Don't ever let a rancher tell you different, Mr. Sutter. Half of this work is knowing the animal. The other half is admitting when you don't. Ambrose says you work cattle longer than I've been alive." Ambrose says a lot of things for a man who barely talks. Micah huffed something close to a laugh, then quieter. "My pa always said a woman's got no business out past the porch on a working ranch." Said it more than once. He looked down at his own hands gripping the top rail. "Watching you tonight, I got to thinking he might have been wrong about that." Odessa turned to look at him properly for the first time since he'd walked up. "Your father," she said, "was probably a good man who never once had a woman stand beside him in a barn at 2 a.m. saving something he couldn't save alone." She let that sit a moment. "That's not a failure of judgment, Micah. It's just a gap in his experience. There's a difference. One you can fix. The other you're stuck with." Micah nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they've been handed something worth keeping. "I'd like to learn," he said, "what you know, if you'd teach it." "I'd like that," Odessa said, and meant it more than the words let on. Jubal's moment came 2 nights later, and it came sideways, the way most true things did with Jubal. He found her in the kitchen after supper, alone, writing in her notebook by lamplight, and he hovered in the doorway long enough that she finally looked up. "Something on your mind?" "That tag," Jubal said. Blurted it, really, before he could stop himself. "The one Mr. Thorne keeps in his coat pocket. Ambrose told me what it said." He shifted his weight. "I've been thinking on it since he told me." "And what have you been thinking?" that whoever wrote it never once watched you work a sick calf at midnight. Jubal's ears had gone red, the way they did whenever he said something he considered daring. Seems to me a man who'd write a word like that on a piece of paper never once watched anybody do anything. Just decided from a distance and figured that was good enough. Odessa set her pencil down. That, she said, is a very fine thing to have noticed, Mr. Reed. At your age. Jubal ducked his head, pleased and embarrassed in equal measure, and mumbled something about checking the horses one more time before bed, and left before she could see the smile he was clearly fighting to hide. Odessa sat alone a moment longer with her pencil untouched, and thought not for the first time, but with a clarity that surprised her, that there was something worth staying for in a house where the youngest had thought to defend a stranger's honor without being asked. Later that same week, a letter arrived from her sister in Kansas, forwarded on from the address she'd left with the agency, and Odessa carried it out to the porch steps to read alone, because some things wanted privacy even from a house full of kind strangers. Agnes wrote the way she always had, blunt, loving, entirely without patience for anything she considered foolish. You went off chasing an arrangement you never signed for. One, Agnes had written. In handwriting Odessa could have picked out of 100 others. I told you it sounded like a mistake from the first letter you sent me about it. I still think it might be. But you always were the one who had to see a thing with her own eyes before she'd believe it, even as a girl, even when Mother told you the stove was hot. Write back and tell me you haven't been made a fool of. I worry, Odessa. I don't say that often, so mark it. Odessa read it twice. Folded it. Sat with it a long while, looking out at the pasture, where 3 men who barely knew her a month ago were slowly, without any of them quite noticing, becoming something like the beginnings of a household. She didn't write back that night. She wasn't yet sure what she'd say, but she found, sitting there with the paper in her lap and the wind starting to move down off the ridge, that for the first time in 3 years the truthful answer to her sister's worry might actually be a good one. Word travels in a small town the way water travels downhill. It doesn't need help. It just needs a slope. By the time Caleb rode into Larkspur again, this time to chase down the missing freight himself, since 2 wires from the ranch had gone unanswered, half the county already seemed to know that Broken Spur had taken in that woman from the train, and Wendell Pruitt, predictably, had opinions about it. Careful there, Thorne, Pruitt said, leaning against his own counter with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes himself very funny. Folks are saying you've gone and married the leftovers off a Kansas ranch nobody wanted. Caleb set his jaw. Nobody's married anybody, Wendell. That's not what I hear. Then you're hearing wrong. Same as usual. Pruitt's grin didn't move. Heard she's older than your own mother would have been. Heard you talk more than you work, Caleb said, and one of those 2 things has done more good for this county than the other. That landed. Pruitt's grin flattened out some. Behind him, a woman stepped forward from the dry goods shelf, where she'd clearly been listening the entire time and had finally decided she'd heard enough. Della Marsh ran the boarding house at the far end of Main Street, had buried 2 husbands and outlived a third who simply moved on, and was not, by any account in that town, a woman who minced her opinions when she'd decided to spend one. Wendell Pruitt, she said, you've been running your mouth about that poor woman since the moment she stepped off that train, and I've had about enough of it. Pruitt's face went a shade redder now. Della, don't you now Della me. I sat 2 tables from her at the church social last spring. No. She caught herself, frowning. That's not right. She wasn't at any social, was she? I haven't even met the woman yet, and you've had her whole character settled in your head for a week based on nothing but a look and some old paper tag somebody tied to her trunk. She turned to Caleb, her expression softening considerably. You tell her, Mr. Thorne, that she's welcome to take tea with me any afternoon she likes. Whatever these fools are saying around town, I'd rather judge a person by my own eyes than by Wendell Pruitt's tongue, and that's not saying much for my own eyes, given how little use they've been finding fault in a woman I haven't met. Caleb felt something in his chesties just slightly. At that I'll tell her. You do that. Della gave Pruitt one last withering look before turning back to her shelf of dry goods. And Wendell, the next batch of flour better be weighed proper this time, or I'll be having a different sort of conversation with you entirely. Pruitt busied himself with something behind the counter and didn't trouble Caleb with any further opinions for the rest of the visit, which Caleb counted as the second small victory of the afternoon. He had a wire to send, though, and a growing, unpleasant certainty about who was going to be on the other end of the reply. The telegraph office was a narrow room behind the mercantile that smelled of ink and hot metal, run by a boy named Otis Dunbar, 17 years old and more serious about his job than most senators were about theirs. "Send this to the outfitters in Chalmers Bend," Caleb said, sliding a slip of paper across the counter. "Ask them plain what happened to 60 rolls of wire and 40 cedar posts that should have arrived a week back." "Yes, sir." Otis tapped it out, waited, tapped some more. The reply came back inside 2 hours, which for a wire crossing that much territory felt almost aggressive in its speed. "Order canceled. Cancellation authorized by broker H. Prade, acting on behalf of client. Refund issued to originating account. Regret any inconvenience." Caleb read it twice, standing right there with Otis watching him nervously from behind the counter like he half expected the paper itself to start shouting. "I never dealt with any broker named Prade," Caleb said. Otis shifted his weight from one boot to the other. "Heard that name come through here before. Works for Mr. Coldwell mostly. Handles his purchasing, buys up outfits, supply contracts, that sort of business." His voice dropped, like the walls themselves might repeat it. "Folks don't say his name too loud in here. Coldwell's, I mean, not Prade's. Prade's just the fellow who does the asking on his behalf. Coldwell. Nathaniel Coldwell owned more land in that county than any 3 other men combined, and the manner in which he'd come to own so much of it was not a story that reflected well on him, though it was also not a story anyone could carry into a courtroom, because Coldwell was careful, and careful men leave very little behind for a courtroom to hold on to. He bought up struggling outfits at prices that were technically legal and morally closer to theft. He leaned on supply houses until they gave him terms nobody else could match, and he passed the difference along to smaller ranchers in the shape of bad luck that always seemed to land right when they could least afford to absorb it. Caleb had turned down 2 separate offers from Coldwell's men over the last 4 years. Refused to sell, refused to lease, refused to so much as finish hearing the first sentence of the proposal. He'd always assumed that refusal would cost him something, eventually. He simply hadn't expected it to arrive disguised as a woman with a paper tag tied to her trunk. He was still standing there, wire in hand, when the door opened behind him and a shadow fell long across the floorboards. He didn't need to turn around to know whose carriage had just pulled up outside. "Mr. Thorne." The voice was smooth, unhurried, but the voice of a man who had never once in his life had to raise it to get a room's attention. "Didn't expect to find you in town today." Caleb turned. Nathaniel Coldwell stood in the doorway in a coat that cost more than most men in that county, made in a season hat in hand. Expression from his face that managed to look pleasant and entirely without warmth at the exact same time. "Coldwell," Caleb said, "I understand you've had some trouble with the supply order." Coldwell's mouth curved very slightly. "Unfortunate business, cancellations. Markets shift. Brokers make decisions." A pause timed like a man laying down a card he's been holding for a while. "I also understand you've taken in a house guest." "From the train." Caleb didn't answer right away. Behind the counter, Otis Dunbar had gone very still, the way young men go still when they sense they're standing too close to something they don't fully understand yet. "Word travels fast," Caleb said, "small county." Coldwell's eyes were pale, unblinking, the kind of eyes that had learned long ago they never had to look away first. "I'd be careful, Mr. Thorne, about the company you keep. Some baggage is heavier than it appears on the platform." He settled his hat back onto his head. "I hope your fence gets built before the freeze. Truly, I've always admired a man who won't sell what's rightfully his." Another pause, and this one had teeth in it, though his voice never once rose to match. Even when holding on to it costs him more than it's worth. A second man had followed Coldwell in through the door, while he spoke narrow, precise, dressed a shade too well for a clerk and not well enough for the man he worked beside. He carried a leather ledger under one arm like it was part of his own body. "Mr. Prade," Caleb said, before Coldwell could introduce him, because he'd already put the pieces together and wanted the man to know it. Prade's eyebrows rose, fractionally, the only part of his face that moved. "You have the advantage of me, sir. I got a wire with your name on it an hour ago, canceling an order I never asked you to touch. Business decisions get made every day, Mr. Thorne." Prade's voice had none of Coldwell's smoothness. It was thinner, colder, in its own way the voice of a man who had learned to sound reasonable while doing entirely unreasonable things. "Markets shift. Credit terms get reviewed. I wouldn't take it personally." "Funny," Caleb said. It arrived feeling real personal. Coldwell laughed softly, like a man enjoying a private joke nobody else had been let in on. "Mr. Thorne has a suspicious nature, Prade. Comes from working alone too long, I expect." A man starts seeing conspiracies in ordinary bad luck. He said it lightly, too lightly, and something in the phrase ordinary bad luck landed in Caleb's chest with a weight Coldwell couldn't possibly have known it carried, not unless he'd heard, somewhere, sometime, a widow use nearly that exact same sentence about a storm in Kansas 3 years back. Caleb didn't let his face show what that thought did to him. "I'll get my wire," Caleb said, "same as I get everything else out here. The hard way, if that's what it takes." "I don't doubt it," Coldwell said, and there was something almost like respect buried under the smoothness now, the wary kind a predator reserves for prey, that's put up a more interesting fight than expected. "Good day, Mr. Thorne." They left the way they'd come, unhurried. The bell over the door barely stirred either time. Caleb stood there a long moment with the wire still folded in his fist, and something cold and certain settled into his chest that had nothing at all to do with the coming winter. He rode back to Broken Spur with that certainty sitting in him like a swallowed stone, and by the time he reached the ranch, the light was already going long in gold across the valley. Odessa was out at the north fence with Ambrose, the two of them walking the line together, her pointing at something low on a post, him nodding along in the particular way he had when he'd decided she was right about a thing and didn't especially want to say so out loud. Caleb tied off his horse and walked out to them. She found 2 more posts wanting replacement. Ambrose said flat, no particular inflection, which with Ambrose could mean either impressed or mildly annoyed, and there was no reliable way to tell which. "She's right," Caleb said. "Reset them." Ambrose headed for the barn and the tools. Odessa was watching a cluster of younger calves bunched near the trough, and for a moment neither she nor Caleb said anything at all, the evening settling soft and orange around them, the way it does in that country in September, right before the season turns hard and stays that way. "You look like a man carrying bad news," she said, not turning to face him. "Traced the missing freight. And canceled, on purpose. A broker working for a man named Coldwell." He watched her closely as he said the name, the way he had once already, days ago, when he'd first mentioned the man in passing, and watched something flicker across her face, too fast to name. "I ran into him himself just now, in town." Something in her posture changed. "Small, barely there." "What did he say?" "Made it real clear he knew about you. Called you baggage." Caleb's jaw tightened at the memory of it. Said something about being careful what a man holds on to costing him more than it's worth. Odessa was very quiet. "He sent me here," she said finally. "Not a question." It landed flat and certain, the way a fact lands, when a person has already worked out most of its shape alone, and is only waiting for someone else to confirm the last piece of it. "That's what I think," Caleb said. She looked out at the herd, at the calves, at the mountains catching the last orange light, and her voice, when it came, had gone somewhere very far away. "He chose me on purpose," she said. "Not off any list. He wanted a woman my age, specifically. Wanted a joke he could tie to your name and be certain you'd send her back on the next train, humiliated enough, maybe, that you'd finally consider selling him this land just to be done with the trouble of it." She turned to face him directly, and there was something moving behind her eyes now that hadn't been there before, something that had been sleeping for 3 years and had just, in this exact moment, opened its eyes and sat up. "But he doesn't know very many women, Mr. Thorne." "Probably not the right ones," Caleb said, and something in his own chest loosened, because that was almost a joke, and for one brief unguarded second, he thought she might actually let herself laugh at it. She didn't laugh, but her face came close enough to it that he counted it, quietly, as a small victory, and didn't examine too closely why it felt like one worth having. It was 2 nights later that everything Caleb he understood about the situation turned over completely, and he wasn't even in the room to watch it happen. He'd ridden to town for supplies, ordinary ones this time, flour, coffee, a length of rope, and left Odessa at the ranch with her notes and the ledger she'd started keeping alongside his own, more careful and more organized than his had ever managed to be in 11 years of trying. When he came back near dusk, she was sitting at the kitchen table exactly where he'd left her that morning, except the paper in front of her wasn't a list of feeding schedules anymore. It was blank. Her pencil sat untouched beside her hand. Her face had a stillness to it he hadn't seen before, not even on the platform, not even with the whole town laughing at her back. "You all right?" he said, setting the flour sack down, slow, careful, the way you move around something that might startle. She didn't answer right away. Because how did a person answer that? Because the question itself assumed there was a simple yes or no sitting somewhere inside her, and there wasn't, there hadn't been for 3 years. There had only been a locked room in the back of her mind that she'd walked past every single day, without once turning the handle. Until today. Until Ambrose had mentioned, entirely by accident, entirely without meaning anything by it, that Mr. Coldwell's family had come up out of Kansas some years back. Until that single word Kansas had turned the handle on that locked room, without asking her permission first. "What do you know about Nathaniel Coldwell?" she said finally, when she trusted her own voice to hold steady. "Where his money came from. How long he's had it." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat, because, whatever this was, it wasn't a question a man answered standing up. "Not a great deal," he said. "He's been in this territory close to 8 years, I'd guess. Before that, folks say he kept from Kansas. Made his first real money there, then moved his operation north when the land got expensive enough to sell high." He watched her face carefully while he said it. Watched something in it go very deliberately blank, the way a face goes blank when a person is working hard not to let it do anything else. "Why?" "Kansas," she repeated. Not a question, just the word sitting alone in the room like it weighed something none of the furniture could bear. "Odessa." She looked up at him, and whatever had been holding steady in her expression for 3 years, because he understood, much later, that it had been 3 years exactly, that this had been sitting folded and quiet inside her, since the spring her husband died, whatever had been holding it together cracked, just slightly, just enough that he saw straight through to what was underneath. "My husband's name was Elijah," she said. "We ran cattle together for 22 years mostly. Some hard ones too, but good, taken as a whole." She folded her hands together on the table, tight, knuckles going pale. "In the spring of 1875, a man came to our door with an offer to buy our land, offered us less than half what it was worth. When Elijah refused him twice because the man came back a second time, more insistent than the first, things started going wrong." She stopped. Started again, because stopping wasn't going to make any of it easier to say. Cattle turning up sick that hadn't been sick the week before. A creditor calling in a note early, one that had never once been called early in 15 years of doing business together. Small things. Her voice didn't shake. That was the part that would sit with Caleb for a long time afterward. How steady she kept at it. The words underneath it were anythings but steady. The kind of small things that don't look like a pattern until you've lived through enough of them, one after another, to finally recognize the shape they're making. "There was a land survey filed that same spring," she went on. "Changed a boundary line by nearly 40 acres right along our water access. Elijah fought it. Rode the county seat. Hired a lawyer in Topeka we couldn't rightly afford, and spent money we didn't have proving that survey was wrong." A small humorless breath, almost a laugh, almost not. "And he won. Got the boundary corrected. I remember thinking foolishly. I understand that now. I remember thinking that was the end of it." She looked at her own folded hands like they belonged to someone else. "In February of 1876, not even a year later, Elijah rode out to check the herd during a bad storm, and he didn't come back." She stopped talking. For a moment she wasn't in the kitchen at all. She could still see it if she herself. The lamp burning low in the window while the storm tore at the shutters, snow coming sideways, not falling, driving hard enough to sting bare skin through wool. She'd told him not to go, told him the herd would survive one bad night better than he would. He'd only kissed the top of her head, the way he always did before doing exactly what he'd already decided to do, and said something about the storm, not caring what either of them was afraid of, and gone out into it anyway. Because that was who he was. Because in 22 years of marriage, she had never once managed to talk him out of a thing once his mind had settled on it. She'd stood at that window until the lamp burned down to nothing, watched the snow fill in his tracks within minutes of him leaving, like the storm itself was in a hurry to erase any sign he'd ever crossed that yard at all. Morning came gray and merciless and far too quiet. She found him herself, in the end, because none of the hands could bring themselves to be the one to do it, and some part of her had already known, walking out into that frozen pasture with her coat only half buttoned, exactly what she was going to find before she found it. His horse, favoring one leg, 300 yards off, otherwise unhurt. Elijah still in the snow, his neck bent at an angle a neck was never meant to bend. One hand still loosely closed around a length of rein he'd apparently never once let go of, even falling. She had knelt there a long time before she let herself scream, long enough that her knees went numb before her voice did. "They found him the next morning," she said, and her voice, coming back into the room, back into the present, had gone very quiet. His horse had thrown him, broke his neck against a fence post. The kitchen had gone entirely silent around her words. Everyone called it an accident, she said, and maybe it was. He'd ridden through worse storms 100 times before that night and never once come off that horse. But I never had a single piece of paper that said it was anything other than bad luck. So I buried my husband. Sold the ranch to his brother, because I couldn't bear the thought of running that particular piece of ground alone anymore. And I told myself that was simply what grief does to a person's judgment. Makes them see conspiracies hiding inside ordinary bad luck. She looked up at him. I never knew the name of the man who tried to buy our land, she said. He never once came to the door himself. Always sent someone else to do the asking for him. I only ever knew him as a signature on a letter. A name I hadn't thought about in 3 whole years. Her eyes stayed dry. But there was something moving behind them now that was very far from calm. Nathaniel Coldwell. The kitchen went entirely quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up off the ridge the way it always did once the sun dropped low behind the mountains, a long, low sound moving through the valley, like something breathing in its sleep. Caleb sat across the table from a woman he had known for 11 days, and it already felt like a number too small to hold what had happened inside it. A woman who had stepped off a train with a word tied to her belongings and had spent every one of those 11 days proving, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, exactly how wrong that word was. And he understood, sitting there in the lamplight with the coffee gone cold between them, that this was no longer simply a matter of a stolen fence order and a cruel joke played by a rich man with too much time on his hands and too little conscience to fill it with anything decent. This was older than that, deeper than that. Because if what she was telling him was true, and looking at her face, at the exhausted steadiness of a person who's carried suspicion alone for years, and finally set it down in front of another human being, he did not doubt for one single second that it was true. Then Nathaniel Coldwell had not sent Odessa Vance to Broken Spur as a random cruelty, had not plucked her name at whim off some agency list simply because she was over 40 and widowed, and therefore by his own cold accounting, disposable. He had sent her because he knew exactly who she was. Because somewhere in Nathaniel Coldwell's ledgers, tucked among the falsified surveys and the early called notes and whatever precise, deniable arrangement had put a grieving man's neck against a fence post in a February storm, there was a name he had never quite let go of, a debt he still considered unfinished. A woman he'd assumed, 3 years and several hundred miles distant, he could still reach out and touch whenever it suited him. Still label worthless. Still hand off like a piece of damaged freight to whatever inconvenient corner of his territory happened to need one. He had not been trying to hurt a stranger. He had been trying to finish something started years before Caleb Thorne had ever laid eyes on either one of them. Odessa, very quiet. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that she'd know it was there if she wanted it. This one? No, she said. It wasn't. Outside, the wind kept moving down off the ridge, carrying the first hard bite of the coming season, and neither of them said another word for a long while. There wasn't a sentence small enough yet to hold what had just been set down on that table between them, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next at Broken Spur was not going to be about fence posts, or a missing supply order, or a marriage arrangement gone sideways at a train station. It was going to be about a debt one rich man in that territory believed had never been properly collected, and a woman who had just sitting in a stranger's kitchen with cold coffee in front of her and a folded paper tag still resting somewhere upstairs in that stranger's coat pocket, that she was finished letting him decide when that debt was settled. Because some words, once written down and tied to a person, don't come off quite so easily as string from a trunk handle. And some debts, Nathaniel Coldwell was about to learn, don't stay buried simply because a widow chose to be quiet about them for 3 long years. They talked until the fire burned down low and the lamp needed trimming twice. Not about plans, not yet. There wasn't a plan yet, not a real one. Nothing beyond the simple fact that both of them now understood the shape of what they were up against, and understanding the shape of a thing is not the same as knowing how to fight it. But something had shifted in the room all the same, something that neither of them said aloud, because saying it aloud felt too much like tempting whatever ill luck Coldwell still had left to spend. You could still take the train, Caleb said finally, because it felt like the honest thing to offer, even though every part of him hoped she'd refuse it. I meant what I said on the platform. Nobody's choosing for you. Odessa looked at him for a long moment across the table. the lamplight catching the gray in her hair, the steadiness back in her eyes. Now the same steadiness he'd first seen the moment she'd stepped down off that train and refused to let a whole platform of laughing strangers decide who she was. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "a man tried to buy my land once by making my life smaller and smaller until I had no room left to refuse him. It didn't work then, though I didn't understand for a long while afterward that it hadn't worked because of anything I did on purpose. I simply hadn't been given the chance to fight back before the choice was taken from me entirely." She folded her hands on the table, and there was something in the gesture that looked less like exhaustion now and more like resolve settling into its proper place. "I have that chance now. I don't intend to waste it running for a train." "The winter's coming hard," Caleb said, "and he's not going to stop with a canceled supply order." "No," she agreed, "he isn't. Men like that rarely stop at the first failure. They simply change their method." She looked toward the window, toward the dark shape of the mountains standing indifferent against the last of the night. "But he's been operating on an assumption for 3 years, Mr. Thorne, that the woman he wronged in Kansas stayed quiet because she was weak, because she didn't understand what had been done to her, or didn't have the strength to answer it. And that's wrong. That's wrong," she said, "because I understood exactly what had been done to me. I simply didn't yet have anywhere to stand while I answered it." Her eyes came back to his, steady, unflinching, the eyes of a woman who had spent 3 quiet years waiting without knowing what she was waiting for, and had just discovered, sitting at a stranger's kitchen table on a cold September night, precisely what it had been. "I believe I do now." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the wind kept moving low through the grass, carrying the smell of the coming winter down off the ridge, and somewhere out in the dark, 81 head of cattle stood together against the cold, unaware of any of it. The tag, the ledgers, the debt one, careful, patient, well-dressed man had never once considered fully paid. "Then we'd best get to work," Caleb said. Odessa allowed herself, for the first time since the train platform, something close to a smile. "Yes," she said, "we had." Neither of them knew yet what the coming weeks would cost. Neither of them could have guessed how far Nathaniel Coldwell was willing to go, once his first quiet method had failed to bend a widow who had already survived worse than he understood. But that night, in a small ranch house between 2 ridgelines that didn't much care what happened at their feet, 2 people who had known each other 11 days sat across a kitchen table from one another and, without either of them quite saying so out loud, decided they would rather stand and lose everything than fold quietly and lose it anyway. It was, as decisions went, a small one. Just 2 people, 1 table, a lamp burning low. It would turn out to be the decision that changed everything that came after. Upstairs, later, Odessa sat once more on the edge of the narrow cot and looked at the small tin-framed photograph she'd set on the wobbling table that first night. Elijah Young, squinting into a sun that no longer existed anywhere but in that one square of paper. "I don't know what I'm walking toward," she told him, quietly, the way she still sometimes did, though she'd stopped mentioning it to her sister some time back, because Agnes worried about things like that more than the habit deserved. "I don't know if it's the same man, even. I don't know if knowing his name changes anything at all, except how much it hurts to carry it." The photograph, as photographs do, said nothing back. But the window beside the table faced east, same as it had the first night, and she found herself looking at that, instead at the dark glass, at the faint promise of a horizon she couldn't yet see but knew was out there, waiting on its own schedule, entirely indifferent to whether she was ready for it. Nearly 4 years she'd carried a quiet, formless suspicion with nowhere to set it down. Nearly 4 years of telling herself grief made a person see conspiracies in ordinary bad luck, until a stranger's coat pocket and a length of string had finally given that suspicion a shape she could hold. She did not know that night everything that was coming. Did not know about the fire that would take a section of cedar posts and nearly a man's life along with it. Did not know about a broker's ledger with her husband's death folded quietly into its margins, or a broken young man named Gideon who would one day have to choose between a debt he owed his brother and a debt he owed his own conscience. Did not know how far a careful, patient, well-dressed man was willing to go once his first quiet method failed against a widow who had already survived worse than he understood. She only knew, lying back at last against a thin pillow in a stranger's spare room, that for the first time in 3 years the locked door at the back of her mind had finally been opened, and that, whatever waited on the other side of it, she did not intend to close it again. Outside, the wind kept moving down off the ridge, carrying the first hard bite of the season that was coming. And somewhere past the dark glass of the east-facing window, morning was already on its way, whether anyone at Broke Ranch was ready for it or not. Morning came the way Caleb had promised it would, whether anyone at Broken Spur was ready for it or not. And what it brought with it was work. Plain unglamorous, unrelenting work, the kind that didn't care about ledgers or land debts, or a rich man's grudge 3 years buried in a Kansas snowstorm. There were posts to set, wire to string, a herd to bring through winter strong enough to sell, because whatever else Nathaniel Coldwell wanted, the auction was still going to happen, and Broken Spur still had to walk into it standing on its own 2 feet. The trouble was the wire itself, because there wasn't any. Because the Chalmers Bend order was gone, refunded, canceled, and every other outfitter within 2 days' ride had suddenly developed a curious reluctance to sell to a man named Thorne. Not a refusal exactly, just delays. We'll see what we can do. Stock's thin this season. Nothing anyone could point to and call proof. Just a pattern, closing in slow. There's Cross's Mill, Ambrose said, the third morning of dead ends, standing at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, like a man delivering unwelcome news. 20 miles north. Rough cut, not milled cedar, but lumber's lumber if you set it deep enough. Emmett Cross, Caleb said. Man stubborn as a stuck gate hinge. Stubborn's what we need right about now, Odessa said, not looking up from her notes. A man who won't be told what to do by anybody is exactly the kind of man Coldwell hasn't gotten to yet. She was right, and Caleb rode north the next morning to find out just how right. Emmett Cross ran his mill the way he apparently ran his whole life, loud, blunt, and thoroughly unimpressed by threats delivered secondhand. Fella came through here last month, Cross said, spitting to one side, sawdust caught in his eyebrows like snow that had forgotten to melt. Real polished sort. Said it'd be in my interest to limit my dealings with the smaller outfits this season. Meaning you, Thorne, though he didn't say your name direct. Careful men rarely do. What'd you tell him? Told him where he could put his interest. Cross grinned, gap-toothed and entirely without malice. Man like that, you give him an inch, he starts thinking he owns the mile. I've been cutting lumber in this county 30 years. Nobody's told me who to sell to yet, and I don't much care for starting now on account of some dandy in a good coat. The price was steeper than milled cedar would have been. Caleb paid it without arguing, because arguing was a luxury he didn't have room for anymore, and rode back with the first load himself, while Micah and Jubal made 2 more runs over the following 3 days. By the end of that week, Broken Spur had enough rough-cut lumber to close the North Gap entirely and reinforce the stretch along the creek that Odessa had flagged her very first night on the property. Weeks before any of them had known what they were truly up against. Ambrose ran the fence crew. Methodical, unhurried. The way a man works when he understands the whole shape of a job before he ever picks up the first tool. Odessa walked the line with them on the second day. Not to supervise. Just to see how the ground sat underfoot, the way terrain read different walking it than it did looking at it from the saddle. There's a low spot, she told Ambrose. That evening, northwest corner. Snowmelt's going to collect it there come spring and undermine the posts if they're not set deep enough now. Ambrose reset 3 posts the next morning without being asked twice. Something had shifted in him over the past weeks, and Caleb had watched it happen, the way he watched most things at Broken Spur now quietly, from the edges, without commenting on it out loud. Ambrose, who had never in 6 years volunteered an opinion he wasn't asked for directly, had started saying we instead of you when he talked about the ranch's plans. We ought to close that gap before the ground freezes. We're going to need more feed than last winter. Way this herd's filling out. We, not you, boss. We, Caleb noticed. Didn't say anything about it. Some things he'd learned went better left to find their own footing. By the second week, the fence held. The gaps were closed. And for 3 whole days, Broken Spur felt, for the first time in longer than anyone there cared to admit, like an operation that might actually survive the winter. One evening, with the last of the posts set and the light going soft and gold across the pasture, Odessa stood at the fence rail beside Caleb, both of them watching the herd move slow and settled in the dusk. It looks like a ranch again, she said, quiet, almost surprised by her own words. It never stopped being one. No, she considered that. But it stopped feeling like one had a chance somewhere along the way. Before I got here, you'd stopped expecting it to work out, hadn't you? Caleb didn't answer right away, because the honest answer embarrassed him and because admitting it out loud made it more true than he was entirely ready for. Some days, he said finally. And now. He looked at her instead of the herd. Now I'm not so sure I've got the right to stop expecting things anymore. Odessa didn't answer that. But she didn't look away either, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the dusk settling soft around them, the fence finally whole beneath their hands. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took Nathaniel Coldwell to hear about it. He heard, because he always heard. A man at Cross's mill who supplemented his wages, passing along whatever he saw to whoever paid to hear it. Coldwell paid well and paid quietly, and had ears in more corners of that county than most men had corners in their own houses. He heard that Broken Spur's north pasture was closed. Heard the widow was still there, hadn't taken any train east, hadn't folded the way a woman her age was supposed to fold when the world made clear what it thought she was worth. Heard the calves were fattening, the fence was holding, the whole operation was tilting slowly, in direction he had specifically arranged for it never to tilt. He sat with that information a long while in his study, and concluded, the way he concluded most things, without heat and without hurry, that the situation required adjustment. Praed stood near the window, ledger tucked under one arm as always, waiting to be told what came next. The woman's more resourceful than anticipated, Coldwell said, not turning from the fire. It wasn't quite a complaint. Closer to an observation, the kind a man makes about weather that's proven more stubborn than the almanac promised. Years I assumed silence meant surrender. I begin to suspect I was wrong about that. Shall I make further inquiries about her situation, sir? No. Coldwell finally turned, and there was nothing warm in his face at all now, none of the smoothness he'd worn so easily in the mercantile. Inquiries have run their course. The supply pressure hasn't moved him. Time Mr. Thorne understood precisely how much he stands to lose by continuing to refuse me. A pause, deliberate, the pause of a man who had made this particular kind of decision before, and felt no special weight in making it again. Send for Sharp. The supply pressure had failed. The widow hadn't broken. So he needed a different method. And he needed it before the auction, because if Broken Spur's herd sold well, Thorne would have enough to carry through winter, enough to get ahead of that banknote for the first time in years, and Coldwell would be right back where he'd started 3 years and 400 miles ago, watching a stubborn family refuse to sell him something he'd already decided, in his own mind, belonged to him. He called for Gideon Sharp. The night before the fire, nobody at Broken Spur knew to be afraid, which was its own kind of cruelty, looking back on it. Supper had been ordinary, almost good. Even Odessa had found a way to make the salt pork palatable that Jubal declared, around a full mouth, the finest thing he'd eaten since Christmas, which everyone at the table understood to be considerable exaggeration, and nobody bothered correcting. Micah had laughed at something, Jubal said, a real laugh easy, the kind that had gotten rarer around that table before Odessa arrived and had started coming back since. Caleb had gone to bed that night thinking, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that the worst of it might genuinely be behind him. He was wrong. Picking up cold off the ridge sometime after midnight carried no warning of that at all. Just carried, eventually, without anyone noticing until it was already too late to matter, the faint, sharp smell of coal oil drifting toward a barn full of sleeping horses and 80 bales of dry September hay. The fire came in the deep, dark hour when even the wind seemed to be sleeping. Micah smelled it first, woke choking on it, rolled off his bunk still half dreaming, and by the time his mind caught up to what his lungs already knew, the hay barn was already burning at both ends. Orange light licking up through the loft, and the horses inside were screaming. Fire, his own voice sounded like a stranger's, torn raw. Fire, fire, get up. Fire, the yard came apart into chaos. Caleb ran out in his shirt sleeves, boots half-laced, and the heat hit him 20 feet from the barn door, like a wall he'd walked into. Jubal was already there, hauling water in a bucket that did next to nothing against a blaze that size, and Ambrose was fighting the corral gate, trying to get the panicking horses loose before the loft came down on top of them. Odessa didn't scream, didn't freeze. She grabbed the wet grain sacks stacked by the pump because she'd noticed, weeks ago, exactly where they were kept, filed it away the way she filed everything, and started beating at the flames, licking along the barn's near wall, buying seconds, just seconds, while Ambrose worked the gate. Micah, get the calves out of the near pen now, he went. Didn't think. Just went, straight along the fence line toward the pen, closest to the burning structure, because the panic in the herd was already spreading, animals throwing themselves against rails that weren't built to hold that kind of terror. That was when the section of loft gave way. It came down without warning, 100 pounds of burning timber and hay, and Micah, half turned toward the calves, didn't see it until it was nearly on top of him. He threw himself sideways, mostly cleared it, mostly. A beam caught his shoulder and drove him hard into the fence rail, and he went down in the dirt with a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like all the air in him leaving at once, and didn't get back up. And Caleb reached him first, dragged him clear by the collar, away from the heat, away from the animals now breaking through the weakened rail and scattering into the dark in every direction at once, the way cattle do when fear finally beats whatever thin discipline had been holding them in place. Odessa was there a heartbeat later, kneeling in the dirt, hands already moving over Micah's shoulder with the same steady, unhurried precision she'd used on the calf weeks before, except her own hands weren't quite steady this time, weren't quite steady at all. "Collarbone," she said, and her voice, for the very first time since the train platform, had a crack running through it she didn't try to hide. "Broken. Not through the skin. He'll live. He'll live, Caleb. But I need cloth. I'm here," Caleb said, low, close to her ear, because she'd said his name, his first name, not Mr. Thorne, and somewhere in the wreck of that night, that small fact landed in his chest and stayed there. "I'm right here. Tell me what to do," she told him. Cloth torn clean from a shirt Jubble sacrificed without being asked twice. A splint, fashioned rough and fast from a broken fence slat. Her hands found their steadiness again once there was work to put them to, the way hands often do, and Caleb held Micah still while she bound the shoulder tight, and around them the barn kept burning, and somewhere out in the dark Ambrose was still shouting after scattered cattle, and none of it, for one strange suspended minute, felt as loud as the sound of Odessa's breathing finally slowing back toward steady. "You did well," she told Micah when the binding was done. "You went for the calves first. Not yourself. That matters, whatever this shoulder cost you these next few weeks." Micah, pale and shaking, managed something close to a smile. "Didn't feel like doing well." "It rarely does," Odessa said. "That's usually how you know it was." The fire took most of the night to burn itself down to nothing worth saving. By the time the sky went gray with dawn, the hay barn was a blackened skeleton, still smoking, and the herd was scattered across 200 yards of open dark that would take the better part of the morning to gather back. One calf didn't make it, trampled in the panic, or caught too close to the flames. Nobody was ever entirely sure which. Odessa found it herself at first light and stood over it a long moment with her jaw tight and her eyes dry and something moving behind them that was very far from calm. Micah's shoulder was set and bound by the time the sun cleared the ridge. He'd live, same as she'd promised. But he sat pale and shaking on the porch steps, 24 years old and looking, in that one raw hour, like a boy who badly wanted someone older in the room, and Odessa sat beside him without a word and simply put her hand over his good one until the shaking eased some. Caleb walked the burned ground himself once the light was strong enough to see by, and it didn't take him long to find what he already suspected he'd find. A patch near the base wall where the char smelled wrong. Sharper. Chemical underneath the ordinary smoke, coal oil. Not an accident. Not lightning. Not a dropped lantern. Not any of the 1,000 ordinary ways a barn burns down on a working ranch. Somebody had walked up to that wall in the dead of night and poured it on purpose. He stood there a long while with that knowledge sitting cold in his chest and thought about Nathaniel Coldwell's voice in the Mercantile. Some baggage is heavier than it appears on the platform, and understood finally and completely that whatever quiet method the man had started with had just given way to something with real teeth in it. Somebody could have died last night. Somebody very nearly had. Word of the fire reached town before breakfast, the way bad news always outran good in that county, and by mid-morning Della Marsh herself arrived at Broken Spur in her own buggy, unannounced, with 2 other women from town and a wagon bed loaded with bread, salve, spare blankets, and a jar of something strong enough to make even Ambrose's eyes water when she pressed it into his hands for the pain. "And don't argue with me about it. Wendell Pruitt's already telling anyone who'll listen." "It was lightning," Della said, setting a basket down on the porch rail with more force than strictly necessary. "Man's never once in his life let a fact interfere with a good rumor. I told him plainly I didn't believe a word of it, and neither does anybody else with sense." Dessa exhausted. Soot still caught along one sleeve she hadn't yet had the chance to change. Found herself oddly moved by the sight of women she'd never properly met arriving, simply because trouble had come to a neighbor's door. It wasn't a thing Kansas had prepared her for. Not exactly Kansas had its own kindness, but this particular breed of it, showing up unasked with bread and blankets before the smoke had even fully cleared, struck her as something worth remembering. You didn't need to come, Odessa told her. No, Della agreed, entirely unbothered by the observation. I didn't need to. I wanted to. There's a difference, and I'd think a woman like you would know it better than most. She studied Odessa a moment, something shrewd and not unkind in her expression. You're one of us now, whether this county's finished deciding that officially. Whoever did this to you is going to find that out the hard way, same as Wendell Pruitt found out. Running his mouth doesn't buy him much around here anymore. Odessa didn't have an answer ready for that. Just nodded and let herself, for one brief unguarded moment, feel something close to belonging. Micah healed slow over the days that followed, the shoulder mending the way bones do, in its own stubborn time, regardless of how impatient the man attached to it happened to be. Odessa checked the binding every morning without fail, and somewhere in that daily ritual, the quiet competence of her hands, the way she talked him through the pain instead of around it, something settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not quite mother and son. Closer to two people who had chosen each other, the way ranch families sometimes did, out of necessity that had slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when, turned into something warmer. You could have let Ambrose tend it, Micah said one morning, watching her work. I could have, Odessa agreed. Ambrose is a fine hand with cattle and a poor one with people. You needed both this week. Micah didn't have an answer for that. Just let her finish, and said, "Thank you, ma'am," quieter than usual, and meant it more than the two words let on. It took 4 days to find the man who'd done it, and when they finally did, it wasn't through cleverness. It was through guilt, which has a way of announcing itself in a small town whether the guilty party intends it to or not. Gideon Sharp was 26 years old, worked odd jobs around Chalmers Bend, and had been seen by more than one person, once anyone bothered to ask, riding hard toward Broken Spur the night of the fire and hard away from it an hour later. Caleb found him at a rooming house on the edge of town, and the moment Sharp opened the door and saw who was standing on the other side of it, whatever nerve he'd been running on for 4 days simply gave out. Because he'd known this was coming. Because a man doesn't sleep well after what he'd done, and the not sleeping shows plain on a face, and Caleb could see it the second the door swung open, the hollow eyes. The trembling hand still gripping the frame. A man who'd been waiting to be caught the way some people wait for weather they already know is bearing down on them. I didn't want to, Sharp said, before Caleb had even said a word. Just said it, flat, like a confession he'd been holding behind his teeth so long it had started hurting more than the truth would. Then why'd you do it? Sharp's hands were shaking. He sat down hard on the edge of his own bed, like his legs had stopped being willing to hold him upright. My brother, he said. Thaddeus. He borrowed against Coldwell 2 years back. Bad year, bad harvest seemed like a sensible loan at the time. A humorless breath, close to a laugh, entirely without any humor in it. Coldwell called the note due last month. All of it at once. More than Thaddeus could raise in a lifetime, let alone a month. Told me through prayed, he never once said it himself. Careful men don't told me the note could wait, if I did him one small favor first. A barn, Caleb said. You call that small? I didn't know anybody was inside. Sharp's voice cracked. I checked. I swear before God I checked. There was no light in the bunkhouse. I thought it'd just burn, and that'd be the end of it. Insurance, inconvenience, nothing worse than that. I didn't know your man was going to be in that pen when the loft came down. I didn't. He stopped, put his face in his hands. I've been sick about it every hour since. Every single hour. Caleb stood there a long moment, fists clenched, every instinct in him wanting to make this young man pay for what 4 days of guilt clearly hadn't already made him pay. But he thought of Micah on the porch steps, pale, shaking, younger in that moment than his 24 years had any business looking. And he thought, too, of what Odessa would say if she were standing here instead of him, because he'd started, somewhere in the last weeks, thinking that way more often than he used to. He didn't hit him. Just said, low and hard, you're going to tell this to the sheriff. All of it. Coldwell's name included. He'll ruin Thaddeus. The note's already ruined your brother, whether you burn my barn or not. Least, this way it does some good on the way down. Sharp sat with that a long moment, head in his hands, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had changed. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to the particular exhaustion of a man setting down a weight he'd never wanted to carry in the first place. He'll come after Thaddeus regardless, Sharp said, the moment he learns I talked. Maybe. Caleb didn't soften it, because a lie wouldn't have helped either of them. Or maybe a man that careful doesn't want his name anywhere near a barn fire once the sheriff starts asking questions. Careful men protect themselves first, Sharp. Every time. You might be surprised how fast he cuts you and your brother both loose the second you stop being useful to him. Something in that seemed to land harder than anything else Caleb had said. That's a hell of a thing to hope for, Sharp said quietly. Being cut loose by the man who ruined you. It's not hope, Caleb said. It's just what men like Coldwell do. Every single time. Odessa was the one who went to see Gideon Sharp 2 days later, after the sheriff had taken his statement, after the whole ugly business had started its slow crawl toward whatever consequence it was eventually going to reach. Caleb hadn't asked her to. She simply went on her own, riding into town with a small basket of bread and salve she'd mixed herself, because that was who she was, whether the world had ever once bothered to notice it or not. Sharp looked at her like he expected to be struck. Ma'am, I don't understand. You're not eating, Odessa said, setting the basket down. Guilt does that to a person. I know the feeling better than most. I burned your barn, near killed a man. You did. She didn't soften it, didn't dress it up kinder than it deserved, and you're going to carry that a long while. Whatever comes of the sheriff's business, that's not something I can fix for you, and I wouldn't try. She looked at him steadily. But a man who's sick with what he's done isn't the same as a man with no conscience at all, Mr. Sharp. Coldwell's got plenty of the second kind working for him. I'd rather you weren't one of them for the rest of your life, on account of one terrible night. Sharp stared at her, and something in his face cracked open the look of a person who has braced for cruelty so long he doesn't quite know how to stand up straight once it fails to arrive. Why, he said, would you do that for me? Because somebody did something close to it for me once. Odessa said, on a train platform, a few weeks back, when I had every reason to expect the opposite. She stood. Eat the bread, Mr. Sharp, and when the time comes, tell the whole truth. It's the only thing left in this that's still fully yours to give. Judge Cornelius Ray had practiced land law in that territory for over 20 years, and in all that time, he told Caleb, settling his spectacles and steepling his fingers across his cluttered desk, he had rarely seen a pattern quite so carefully constructed as the one now sitting in front of him. The Kansas survey, Ray said, from 1875. The one your Mrs. Vance mentioned the boundary dispute her husband won. What about it? I wired an old colleague in Topeka, had him pull the original filing. Ray tapped the papers in front of him. It was corrected in 1875. Yes. Elijah Vance fought it, and won exactly as she told you. But the correction itself references an earlier survey, the one Vance was disputing in the first place. And that earlier survey, Mr. Thorne, was never properly filed by the county surveyor of record at all. Caleb sat forward. Meaning somebody forged it, used a real surveyor's seal, lifted or copied from an earlier legitimate filing, and attached it to a boundary line that surveyor never actually walked or measured. Ray's voice had gone very careful, very precise, the voice of a man laying out something he understood to be considerably larger than it first appeared. It's a serious matter on its own, Mr. Thorne, land fraud, 4 years old, in another territory entirely. But it tells us something important about the man we're dealing with here, which is that Nathaniel Coldwell did not simply try to buy the Vance land and fail, Ray said. He committed a crime trying to take it, 4 years before your fence order ever went missing, and a man who's already proven willing to forge a legal document to get what he wants, a man with that particular history. Mr. Thorne is not a man who's going to stop at a barn fire. The room went quiet. Outside the window, the afternoon light was already starting to lean long across the street, and somewhere out past it, 3 weeks in closing, the Larkspur auction yard sat waiting, indifferent to any of this, the way land and time both tend to be. There's more, Ray said, and something in his tone made Caleb's stomach go tight all over again. I sent a second wire. The Billings marriage agency, Mrs. Vance mentioned the one that placed her here. A pause, careful, deliberate. The clerk who handled that arrangement no longer works there. Left 3 months back, under circumstances the agency wasn't eager to discuss over a telegraph wire. You think she knows something? I think, Ray said, that a woman who was let go from her position 3 months before your Mrs. Vance was sent here under false pretenses is exactly the sort of person a careful man like Coldwell would be very interested in keeping quiet. Caleb sat back in his chair, the full weight of it settling over him slow. You're saying he'd move against her too, if he thought she might talk? I'm saying, Ray said, folding his hands together atop the desk, that a man capable of forging a land survey and, if what you've told me about that barn fire is accurate, capable of ordering a man's home burned to the ground, that man does not draw a line at intimidating a single clerk in a hotel room. I'd find her, Mr. Thorne, soon. Before Coldwell's people think to find her first. The words sat cold in the office air. Soon, Caleb repeated. Today, if you can manage it. Her name was Josephine Merrick, and it took Caleb 2 days and a wire to a freight man in Billings to learn that she was currently staying at the Larkspur Hotel under her own name, plain as anything, which struck him as either remarkably careless of Coldwell's people or remarkably deliberate bait, maybe, though he couldn't yet say for what. It was Odessa who insisted on going herself. She'll talk to another woman before she'll talk to you, Odessa said, already pulling on her coat. Especially one who understands exactly what it costs to be discarded by men who never once had to answer for it. The hotel sat at the quiet end of Main Street, respectable, unremarkable, and Caleb waited outside with the wagon while Odysseus went in alone, because she'd asked him to, and because he'd learned, in the weeks since a train platform and a tag that read worthless, that some doors this woman needed to walk through by herself. She found Josephine Merrick's room on the 2nd floor. Knocked twice. The woman who opened it was younger than Odessa had expected. 30 maybe, with tired eyes and a stiffness in the way she held the door, not rude, exactly, but braced, the way a person braces who has learned to expect trouble every time a stranger knocks. I don't know you, Josephine said. No, Odessa agreed, but I believe you knew of me, before I ever stepped off a train. Something in Josephine's face went very still. You'd best come in, she said, and shut the door quick behind you. Inside, low and urgent, Josephine told her the rest of it, that she'd handled the correspondence for the arrangement herself on instruction from a broker she now understood worked for Coldwell, that she'd been told, specifically, to find the oldest unmarried woman on the agency's rolls, someone with no family close enough to intervene, someone the instructions had described. She could still see the phrasing. She said, could still see it typed clean on the page as unlikely to be accepted. I kept a copy, Josephine said, of the instructions. I don't rightly know why, except something in me knew I might need it someday, and I've learned not to argue with that particular instinct. She glanced toward the door, lowered her voice further still. There's a man's been in the hotel lobby 3 days running, watching who comes and goes. I haven't left my room after dark since I noticed him. Coldwell's, I'd wager on it. Odessa sat with that a long moment, the cold certainty of it settling into her chest alongside everything else these past weeks had already asked her to carry. Come stay at Broken Spur, she said finally. Tonight, if you're willing. You'll be safer there than here, and Mr. Thorne has a lawyer in town who's going to want very badly to see whatever you've kept a copy of. Josephine was already reaching for her bag when a floorboard creaked out in the hallway. Close, too close. Both women went still. That's him, Josephine breathed, barely a whisper. The one who's been watching the lobby. He must have followed you up. Odessa's mind moved fast, faster than her pulse, which was doing something considerably less composed because there was no backstair, because the window was 2 floors up and no kind of exit at all, because the only door out of this room was the same door that man was standing behind, and waiting quietly wasn't going to make him go away. So she didn't wait quietly. She crossed the room, opened the door herself wide, without hesitation, and found a broad-shouldered man in a plain coat frozen mid-step in the hallway, clearly not expecting the door to simply open on its own. Can I help you? Odessa said, pleasant as a church social, or are you simply in the habit of loitering outside a ladies' room at this hour? The man's mouth opened, closed. Whatever instructions he'd been given plainly hadn't accounted for being addressed directly in daylight by a woman entirely unbothered by his presence. Wrong floor, he managed finally. I imagine it was, Odessa said, and shut the door firmly in his face, and stood with her back against it a moment, heart hammering, now that there was no longer an audience to perform calm in front of. Josephine let out a breath that shook considerably more than Odessa's had. How did you do that? Just open the door at him. Because standing still and being afraid never once solved a single thing in my whole life, Odessa said. It only ever bought the other fellow more time to decide what to do with my fear. She was already reaching for Josephine's bag. We're leaving. Now. Out the front, past him, bold as anything. Because a woman who looks like she's got nothing to hide is a great deal harder to stop than one who's creeping down a back stair. You're not from around here, Josephine said, half laugh, half disbelief, gathering the last of her things with hands that hadn't and quite stopped shaking. No, Odessa agreed. I'm considerably worse than that. I'm from Kansas. Josephine studied her a long moment. Whatever she saw in Odessa's face, steadiness, maybe, or simply the exhaustion of a woman who had also once been discarded and had refused to stay discarded, seemed to settle something in her own. I've been waiting 3 months, Josephine said quietly, for an occasion to say what I know out loud, to somebody who'd actually listen. She reached for her small traveling bag, already half-packed, as though some part of her had known this moment was coming before Odessa ever knocked. I believe this might finally be it. They rode back to Broken Spur in the last hour of daylight. 3 women's worth of history, Odessa's, Josephine's, and the unnamed weight of whatever had happened to Elijah Vance on a Kansas night, 4 years gone, folded now into a single wagon, rolling north under a sky, going the color of an old bruise, same as it had the day Odessa first arrived. Caleb watched them from the driver's bench, Odessa steady beside Josephine, one hand resting briefly, reassuringly, over the younger woman's own, and thought about everything Judge Ray had laid out that afternoon. The forged survey, the vanished clerk, a fire that had nearly cost Micah his life, and had cost one calf its own, a rich man's ledgers, and a debt he still believed had never been properly collected. That evening, once the ranch had quieted, and the immediate danger of the hotel felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely, Josephine sat at the kitchen table with Odessa and drew a folded, worn sheet of paper from the lining of her bag, where she'd clearly kept it hidden a long while. I want you to hear it, Josephine said, before the lawyer does, before it becomes evidence and stops being just words a person can sit with plainly. She read it aloud, low, careful, the way a person reads something they've read too many times already and still can't quite believe. Instructions were to identify the eldest unmarried or widowed woman presently on the agency's active rolls. The letter said, in language dry and businesslike, the particular coldness of a man dictating cruelty the way he'd dictate a grocery order. Preference for candidates with limited family connection, minimal likelihood of local support, and general unsuitability for acceptance by the intended recipient. Compensation to follow upon confirmation of placement. Odessa sat very still through all of it, because hearing it read aloud, in Josephine's own tired voice, was different than knowing it. Somehow, different than simply understanding in the abstract that she'd been chosen on purpose. This was the actual language, the actual arithmetic a man had used to weigh her worth before she'd ever climbed onto that train. Unsuitability for acceptance. He never once used my name, Odessa said quietly when Josephine finished. Did he know? Josephine said. Just a description, like ordering livestock. She folded the paper carefully back along its worn crease. I'm sorry. I should have burned it, maybe, and spared you hearing your own life reduced to a list of qualifications. But I think, in the end, you needed to hear it plain more than you needed to be spared it. You're right, Odessa said. I did. Her hands folded on the table had gone very steady. There's something almost freeing in hearing it said so bluntly. A man who'll write cruelty down in that much detail isn't a man of any real power at all, whatever his bank accounts say. He's simply a small, frightened thing that's learned to dress its fear up as arithmetic. She looked at Josephine. Thank you for keeping it, for finally saying it out loud to somebody who'd listen. Thank you, Josephine said, for opening that door instead of hiding behind it. 3 weeks to the auction. 3 weeks for Nathaniel Coldwell to decide exactly how much further he was willing to go before he finally understood what Odessa Vance had already told Caleb weeks ago now, sitting in a kitchen with cold coffee between them. That some debts don't stay buried simply because the person he'd wronged had chosen, for 3 long years, to be quiet about them. The wind moved down off the ridge, carrying the first true bite of winter, and somewhere behind them, Larkspur's lamps were coming on one by one against the coming dark, small and stubborn, the way small towns always light themselves, against whatever's still out there in the night, whether they can see it coming yet or not. Later that night, once Josephine had been settled into the spare room down the hall, and the house had finally gone quiet around them, Caleb found Odessa on the porch steps again, same as he had that first restless night weeks ago, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her eyes on the same dark shape of mountain. You did something brave today, he said, easing down beside her, walking into that hallway. Della told me what Josephine said about the door. I didn't feel brave. Odessa's voice was quieter than usual, worn thin by a day that had asked a great deal of her. I felt like a woman who'd run out of better options and had to pick the least foolish one available. That's most of what brave actually is, near as I can tell. He was quiet a moment. You've carried a great deal these past weeks. More than anybody ought to carry alone. I'm not alone, she said it simply, without any particular weight behind it, and yet it landed in Caleb's chest, heavier than anything Coldwell had said to him in that mercantile. I keep forgetting that some days. And then I remember it, usually because of something small, Ambrose resetting a post without being told twice, or Jubal defending my honor to nobody in particular, or you folding a piece of paper into your coat pocket, instead of handing it back to me with an apology. She glanced at him. It adds up. Being remembered like that. After a long while of not being. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Just sat with her in the cold, the wind moving low through the grass, the mountains holding their same indifferent watch over everything happening at their feet. 3 weeks, he said finally. 3 weeks, she agreed. He's going to try something worse before it's through. I don't doubt that for a moment. No. Caleb looked out at the dark. Neither do I. Then we'd best be ready for it. Odessa said, same as we were ready for the fence and the fire and everything else he's thrown at us so far. Something steady and unshakable had settled back into her voice, the same steadiness he'd first seen on a train platform weeks ago, before either of them had known how far this fight was going to reach. He spent 3 years assuming I'd stay quiet, Caleb. He's about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. Above them, the first hard stars of the season were coming out over the ridgeline, cold and clear and entirely unbothered by anything happening below, and somewhere out past the dark edge of Broken Spurs land, in a warm study lit by lamps far finer than anything this ranch could afford, a careful man was already deciding what came next. He had no idea yet how little of it was going to go the way he planned. The night before the auction, Josephine Merrick disappeared. Caleb found the spare room empty at first light, the bed made too carefully, the way a person makes a bed when they don't intend to sleep in it again any time soon. Her traveling bag was gone. So was the folded letter she'd carried out of that Larkspur hotel room, like it weighed more than paper had any right to. She's run, Ambrose said, standing in the doorway with his hat already in his hands, a stillness in his voice that meant he was working hard not to sound as worried as he clearly was. Boots are gone from the porch too. She didn't take a horse. Went on foot sometime in the night. Odessa was already pulling on her coat, because there wasn't time to feel the fear properly. Because feeling it properly would have meant sitting with it, turning it over, and there wasn't a spare minute in this whole cold morning for that particular luxury. So she buttoned her coat instead, and made her hands work even though they didn't especially want to, and told herself the only thing that mattered right now was finding her before the freight did. Where would she go? Caleb said. Not back to the hotel. Not with Coldwell's man still watching it. I don't know. Odessa's hands weren't quite steady fastening the last button, and she noticed that, and made them steady anyway, because there wasn't time this morning for hands that shook. But I know what it feels like. The night before you're meant to stand up in front of a room full of strangers and hand a powerful man his own cruelty back to him in writing. She looked at Caleb. Fear does strange arithmetic to a person at 3 in the morning. Makes running feel like the only sensible option left. She found her, in the end, less than a mile down the Larkspur Road, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the tree line with her bag clutched to her chest and her face raw from crying in a way she'd clearly been trying, uselessly, to stop. Josephine. Josephine flinched at her own name like it had been thrown at her. Don't, she said. Don't try to talk me out of it. I've already decided. I'm taking the early freight west, and I'm not going to be anywhere near that auction yard today. And I know exactly what that makes me, so you needn't say it. I wasn't going to say anything, Odessa said, easing down onto the log beside her, careful, unhurried, the way you'd approach a spooked animal that hadn't decided yet whether you were a threat or not. I was going to sit here a while, that's all. They sat. The morning was cold and gray and entirely indifferent to either of their fears, the way mornings tend to be, and after a long silence, Josephine finally spoke, small and raw. He'll ruin me. Coldwell. The moment I stand up in that yard and read those instructions aloud, my name's attached to it forever. No agency in this territory will hire me again. No respectable family will want me handling their correspondence. I'll have traded one kind of ruin for another, and at least the first kind let me eat. That's a real fear, Odessa said. I won't tell you it isn't. Josephine looked at her, surprised, maybe, that Odessa hadn't rushed to argue the point away. But I'll tell you what I know instead, Odessa went on. I know what it costs to stay quiet too, Josephine. I stayed quiet 3 years. Told myself it was grief talking, told myself a respectable widow doesn't go around accusing wealthy men of things she can't prove. And every single one of those 3 years, that silence sat in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed and couldn't pass. She looked out at the gray morning light coming up slow over the ridgeline. I'm not going to tell you speaking is free. It isn't. It cost Elijah his life, in the end, though it took me years to understand that. But silence isn't free either. It only feels that way because the bill doesn't come due all at once. How do you carry it? Josephine asked, knowing what it costs either way. You carry it with somebody else's hand on your arm, Odessa said, and put her own hand there gently on Josephine's sleeve. That's the whole trick of it. Nobody carries a thing like this alone and comes out the other side of it whole. I nearly didn't. You don't have to test that theory yourself. Josephine was quiet a long while. The wind moved through the bare trees above them, and somewhere off toward Larkspur, faint on the cold air, the first whistle of the morning freight sounded up the canyon, the same sound that had carried Odessa into this whole story 11 weeks ago. That's my train, Josephine said. It is. I don't have to be on it. No, Odessa said. You don't. Josephine looked down, at the bag still clutched in her lap, at the folded letter, inside it that had cost her 3 months of hiding and one very frightened night of running, and something in her face settled, slow, the way water settles once the wind that's been troubling it finally dies down. I'm frightened, she said. So am I, Odessa said. I've been frightened since a train station in September. Frightened's never once stopped me from doing the thing that needed doing. I've simply learned to do it frightened because waiting to feel brave first is a wait that never quite ends. Josephine stood slowly and picked up her bag and looked back once toward the sound of the departing freight before turning the other way, toward Broken Spur, toward the auction yard, toward whatever the day still had waiting for her. Walk with me, she said. I don't think I can do the walking part alone either. I wasn't planning on letting you, Odessa said, and they went back together, side by side, the whistle fading behind them into the gray morning air. The Larkspur auction yard sat adjacent to the depot, same as it always had, and by the time Broken Spur's small procession arrived, Caleb and Ambrose driving the herd, Micah riding one-handed with his shoulder still bound tight, Jubal bringing up the rear, Odessa and Josephine following in the wagon with Judge Ray beside them, his own leather case of documents held carefully on his knees. The yard was already thick with buyers from 3 counties over. The herd moved well on the road in. That was the first thing Caleb noticed, and the thing that stirred something in his chest more than he expected. A struggling herd moves badly. Bunches wrong. Balks and startles at nothing. This herd moved with a settled, unhurried confidence that told a story all its own before a single word got spoken in that yard, the story of 11 weeks of careful hands and careful attention, of a woman who'd walked every foot of that fence line herself and made certain the animals behind it wanted for nothing. Nathaniel Coldwell was already there when they arrived, standing near the depot entrance in a coat that caught the morning light like it had been tailored specifically to do so, unhurried at ease, a man who believed still that the outcome of this day had already been decided. He saw Odessa, saw Caleb. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Odessa looked back at him without expression, the same way she'd once told Caleb she'd decided to look at a folded paper tag present, noted, and entirely unremarkable, turned her attention instead to the herd, to Ambrose settling them into the holding pen, to the work still in front of her. Coldwell's herd sold first. That was simply how it worked in that county. The largest operation, setting the order of things without needing to ask, and his cattle were good. Nobody in that yard was foolish enough to pretend otherwise, and his bidding settled at a number that reaffirmed, loudly and publicly, exactly the kind of standing he'd built for himself over 8 careful years. He watched his lot clear the ring with quiet satisfaction, then moved, without hurry, to a position along the rail with a clear line of sight to Broken Spur's holding pen, waiting. When Caleb's lot was finally called, the cattle moved into the show ring, the way healthy animals move unhurried, unbothered, simply being, which was, Odessa had told him once weeks ago at a kitchen table, the only kind of performance that ever mattered to a man spending real money on livestock. Buyers drifted to the rail. Notebooks opened, hold on. Coldwell's voice carried clean across the yard, and the auctioneer, who owed enough to Coldwell's standing in that county to know better than to ignore it, paused mid-call. I think the buyers here deserve some context about this lot, Coldwell said, turning so the whole crowd could hear him easily. Broken Spur's operation has been struggling for the better part of 2 years. This herd was in poor condition as recently as 2 months ago. I have men who'll attest to that plainly if asked. He let that settle, then added, almost as an afterthought, the timing entirely too practiced to be spontaneous. And the woman, who's apparently been managing the day-to-day of it, isn't quite who she was presented as when she arrived. Sent here from a marriage agency, gentlemen. A woman well past the age most respectable operations would trust with anything of real value. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the judgment involved in staking a herd's reputation on someone like that. He said it smoothly, without heat. The particular smoothness of a man who has rehearsed a cruelty so many times in his own head that it comes out sounding, to anyone not paying close attention, almost like simple honesty. The crowd wasn't silent, but it went quieter. Buyers exchanged the particular kind of look that means uncertainty is spreading and waiting for something, anything to resolve it one direction or the other. Caleb stepped forward, opened his mouth. Josephine Merrick stepped forward first. "My name is Josephine Merrick," she said, clear, unhurried, the words landing in that crowded yard with a steadiness that would have surprised the woman who'd been sitting on a fallen log, crying 2 hours earlier, if she'd had time to notice her own courage before it was already spent in the doing. "I worked at the Billings marriage agency for 6 years. I handled the correspondence for the arrangement that placed Mrs. Vance at Broken Spur Ranch." Coldwell's face didn't move. "Not yet. I have in my possession," Josephine went on, drawing the folded letter from her bag with hands that were steady now, entirely steady, "written instructions I was given, on behalf of a client, directing the agency to identify the eldest widowed woman on our rolls with the least family support and the lowest likelihood of acceptance by the intended recipient." She unfolded it, carefully, and held it up, not reading it aloud yet, simply letting the crowd see that it existed, that it was real paper with real handwriting, not a claim floating free of anything to anchor it. "I'm happy to let any man here examine it directly, and to read it aloud if there's doubt about what it says." The silence that followed had teeth in it. "That's Coldwell started," signed Josephine said, cutting him off, not loud, simply final, by a broker named Prey, whose name, I understand, also appears on a canceled supply order Mr. Thorne received 3 weeks before the auction. She folded the letter back along its worn crease. "I'll let any buyer here draw their own conclusions." Nobody spoke for a long 4 seconds. Then a buyer near the front, a man Caleb recognized from a large operation out of the county seat, gray-haired, unhurried, with no evident patience left for theater. When there was money on the table, walked to the rail of Broken Spurs holding pen and looked at the cattle standing there. He put his hand on 2 of them, checking flank and rib, looked at the calves, came back to the rail and opened his notebook. "What's your opening number?" he said to the auctioneer. The auctioneer glanced once at Coldwell, looked away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "let's open the bidding." What happened next was not slow. 2 more buyers moved to the rail before the gray-haired man had finished his sentence. A third came from the far side of the yard, a woman named Constance Farrow, who ran a sizable operation with her husband and had, Caleb knew, never once bought from Broken Spur before. The bidding tokens began moving, and they moved in one direction, and that direction was not toward Nathaniel Coldwell. Coldwell stood at the edge of the crowd, and for the first time since Caleb had known him, something other than smooth, unbothered calculation was visible on his face. "This proves nothing," he said, raising his voice now, some of the polish finally cracking under it. "A letter unsigned by me directly. A disgruntled former employee with an obvious grievance. I have more than a letter." Judge Ray said, stepping forward from where he'd been waiting, quiet and patient, his leather case now open in his hands. "Mr. Coldwell, I wired a colleague in Kansas some weeks ago regarding a land survey filed in 1875, disputing the boundary of what was then the Vance family property." He drew out a second document, held it up alongside Josephine's. "That survey bears a surveyor's seal, a seal belonging to a man who never once, according to sworn testimony I've now collected, walked that particular boundary line. The seal was copied, forged, Mr. Coldwell, and used to attempt to seize water access from a Kansas ranching family 4 years before you ever set foot in this territory." The crowd had gone entirely still now, the way a crowd goes still when it senses it's watching something considerably larger than a cattle auction unfolding in front of it. "That family," Ray continued, "was Elijah and Odessa Vance. Mr. Vance died the following winter in a storm, under circumstances that were never fully investigated at the time. His widow is standing in this yard today, having been sent here, according to the very document Miss Merrick is holding, specifically because you assumed her too old, too unsupported, and too unlikely to be believed to ever connect the two events. Coldwell's face had gone the color of old ash. You have no proof, he said, that I had any hand in that man's death. No, Ray agreed evenly, not yet. But I have a forged survey with your broker's fingerprints all over its filing history, a canceled supply order authorized by that same broker, and a written instruction to your marriage agency describing a widow in terms that match, disturbingly closely, the exact language your Kansas broker used 4 years ago to describe the woman you were attempting to force off her own land. He closed the case unhurried. That's a pattern, Mr. Coldwell. Patterns interest courts a great deal more than isolated incidents do. It was Gideon Sharp who spoke next, and nobody, least of all Coldwell, had expected him to be standing in that crowd at all. He'd come in quiet, near the back, hat pulled low, and now he pushed forward through the murmuring buyers, with his jaw set and his hands shaking at his sides. The shaking of a man who has decided, finally and completely, do the one thing he's been too frightened to do for weeks. I burned that barn, he said. The words landed flat and enormous in the sudden quiet. On Coldwell's instruction, Sharp went on, louder now, like the first sentence had cost him everything, and the rest were coming easier for the spending of it. Through prayed. My brother owed a note Coldwell called due, all at once, more than we could raise, and I was told the note could wait if I did him a favor first. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. A man nearly died in that fire. Micah Sutter broke his shoulder getting cattle clear of a barn. I set a light on this man's orders. He pointed finally, directly at Coldwell, in front of the whole yard. I've been sick over it every hour since. I'm done being sick alone. Coldwell's composure, which had been cracking slowly since Josephine first spoke, came apart entirely. This is absurd, he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness now, gone thin and fast in a way it had never once been in Caleb's presence before. A disgraced clerk, a criminal arsonist looking to save his own neck. You'll believe anyone who I'll believe evidence. Mr. Coldwell, the gray-haired buyer said, not looking up from his notebook, still calmly writing his bid. And right now that's what I'm seeing a great deal of, standing in this yard, all pointed the same direction. Nathaniel Coldwell was gone from the auction yard before the gavel ever fell on Broken Spur's lot. Caleb noticed that. Noticed the particular timing of it, present for the accusation, absent for the accounting. A man who had spent his whole life understanding exactly when to leave a room before its verdict caught up to him. Prayed left with him, hurrying, the leather ledger clutched tight under one arm, like it might somehow stint in something worth protecting. The bidding, once it resumed, ran longer than anyone in that yard had expected. Constance Farrow opened at a number that made the auctioneer's eyebrows lift, and the gray-haired buyer answered it within seconds, and back and forth it went, climbing steady, neither one willing to be the first to fold. 200, Farrow called. 220, the gray-haired man answered, not even glancing up from his notebook. 242.60. Somewhere behind Caleb, Jubal made a small strangled sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been simple disbelief, and Ambrose put a hand on the boy's shoulder, without taking his own eyes off the ring, the way a man steadies himself as much as anyone else. The numbers traded back and forth, with a determination that had less to do, by the end, with the cattle themselves, and more to do with something else entirely, a widow who'd been called worthless in writing and had just, in the space of 10 extraordinary minutes, proven in front of half the county exactly how wrong that word had always been. The gavel came down at a number Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. Not because it was the largest sum that Yard had ever seen change hands, though it was close, because of what it meant, what it closed, what it made possible that had not been possible a single morning before. He signed the paperwork at the clerk's table with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, and the clerk, who had done this job long enough to have seen grown men's hands shake over both good news and bad, was tactful enough to say nothing about it. Ambrose found him there first. Once the herd had been claimed and settled for rail loading, he didn't say much. Ambrose rarely did. He simply stood a moment, looking at the empty holding pen where 81 head had stood an hour before, and then at Caleb, and offered his hand plain, without ceremony. Good outcome, Ambrose said, which from a man of 6 years' careful economy with words was closer to a speech than most men managed in an hour. Micah shook his hand next, grinning wide despite the shoulder still bound tight beneath his coat, and Jubal simply threw his arms around Caleb entirely. Without warning, the unguarded enthusiasm of a young man who hadn't yet learned to temper his own relief with anything resembling dignity, and Caleb let him, because some moments earned exactly that kind of foolishness. Odessa found him there when the paperwork was finished, the crowd still buzzing around them, with the electric energy of people who had just watched something they aimed their grandchildren in about for 30 years. "It's done," Caleb said. "I know." She'd been doing the arithmetic in her head the same as he suspected, through the whole of the bidding. The note, every dollar of it, and enough left over besides. He looked at her, and something in his chest, which had been carrying that particular weight for going on 4 years now, finally, genuinely, set it down. Enough to rebuild the barn properly. Enough for you stock in the spring. Enough. He stopped. Started again, because the next part deserved better than being said in the middle of a crowded auction yard with strangers still shaking his hand every few seconds. "Can we talk?" Somewhere quieter. They found that quiet at the small cookhouse that ran off the side of the depot, a table outside in the cold, clear air, coffee steaming between them while the yard slowly emptied out behind them into the ordinary chaos of a market day winding down. "I want to draw up a partnership," Caleb said, "proper, filed with the county. Your name on the operation alongside mine, equal say in every decision about that herd, that land, all of it." Odessa studied him a long moment, and something in her chest did a strange, quick thing that she wasn't fully prepared for. Because a partnership, because that word, sitting in the cold morning air between them, meant something entirely different than the word that had first brought her to this valley. Except it also meant work, real work, the kind she understood, the kind that didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly what she already was. So why did her hands feel unsteady all of a sudden? Why did the whole yard, still buzzing with buyers and gossip, and the last business of the morning, seem to have gone quiet around just this one conversation? Stop it, she told herself. And then, because that rarely worked any better now than it had on a train platform a year ago, she simply let herself feel the unsteadiness instead of fighting it, and found oddly that it didn't frighten her the way she'd expected. She watched him do the careful, honest weighing he did with most things, the same weighing he'd first shown her on a wagon ride weeks ago. "Not the kind of arrangement I arrived here believing was on offer," she said. "No." He almost smiled at that. "I'm not asking that. I'm asking because I watched you save a calf's life with your bare hands the week you arrived, and pull a fence line straight that I'd been walking past broken for 2 seasons without seeing it, and open a hotel room door on a man twice your size, because standing still frightened felt worse to you than acting frightened did." He set his coffee down. "That's not something a man hires, Odessa. That's something he recognizes, and if he's got any sense at all, he holds on to it before he's foolish enough to lose it." "I'd need it in writing," she said. "I assumed that. Equal say. Not advisory. Actual equal say on every purchase. My own records. Yes, and I keep my own notes on my own terms regardless of how any of the rest of this goes." "That's fair," Caleb said. She nodded once. The same decided nod. He'd watched her give 100 small facts over these past 11 weeks. The nod that meant a conclusion had been reached, and the matter, as far as she was concerned, was settled. "Then yes," she said. The mortgage note was marked, paid in full 3 days later, and Caleb rode into town himself to collect the documentation, and came back with something else besides a plain wooden frame, the right size for a small folded piece of paper, which he set on the kitchen table without ceremony. Odessa looked at it. Looked at him. "You remembered," she said. "You said, beside the mortgage when it's paid." He set the paid documentation down next to the empty frame. "It's paid." She went to the coat that still hung by the door, his coat, the same one that had carried a folded scrap of paper in its pocket through fire and fear and 11 long weeks of quiet accumulating proof, and drew the tag out herself, for the first time since the day she'd watched him fold it away on a crowded platform. Worthless, she looked at it a long moment. The block letters had faded some, the paper gone soft at its crease, but the word itself hadn't lost any of its original sharpness. Not entirely, not even now. "Accurate," she said finally, which was not at all what Caleb had expected her to say. "How do you mean?" "The frame makes it accurate," she said, sliding the tag carefully behind the glass. This is what one careful, frightened man believed, in September of last year, about a woman he'd never once bothered to meet. She hung it beside the paid mortgage on the wall, near the east-facing window, where morning light would find both of them first. And this, she nodded at the mortgage, at the frame, at the whole quiet room around them, is what turned out to be true instead. She stepped back, studying the two frames together. That's not a sad story, Caleb. That's a complete one. Della Marsh arrived the following week with a bottle of something she called Celebration Cordial, and a curiosity she made no effort to disguise, and stood in front of the two frames on the wall, a long while, arms crossed, nodding slowly to herself. Well, she said finally, Wendell Pruitt hasn't said one word about your age since that auction. Not one. First useful thing that man's silence has ever accomplished. I hadn't noticed, Odessa said, though the small satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth suggested otherwise. You noticed, Della said, entirely unbothered by the mild deception. Everybody notices, they just don't all say it out loud. She poured 3 glasses without waiting to be asked, handed 2 off to Caleb and Odessa, and raised her own toward the framed tag on the wall, to being underestimated by fools who never bothered to look closely enough to know better. Word of what happened that day at the Larkspur auction so moved through the county the way news always did, faster than any reasonable account could hope to travel, and considerably more colorful in the retelling than the truth had strictly required. Nathaniel Coldwell did not remain in that territory. The particular kind of standing he'd spent 8 careful years building did not survive a public accusation of arson, fraud, and a forged land survey 4 states removed. However slowly the wheels of any formal court proceeding might grind toward their eventual conclusion. Merchants who had quietly extended him preferential terms for years began, one by one, adjusting those terms to standard market rate and didn't trouble themselves to explain why. Praed left the county entirely within the month, and nobody, including Coldwell, seemed especially interested in chasing after him. Gideon Sharp stood trial for the fire that winter, and Judge Ray, true to the particular fairness that had made him useful to Broken Spur in the first place, spoke plainly to the court about the coercion behind it, about oak called due specifically to force a desperate man's hand. Sharp served a reduced sentence, and Thaddeus's note was never called due again by anyone, because the man who'd have called it was, by then, in no position to call anything due to anybody. Coldwell's own reckoning came slower, the way reckonings for careful men usually did, grinding forward through territorial courts that had no particular urgency about them, and a wealthy man's lawyers who understood every possible delay available to them. But Praed, faced eventually with his own name attached to a forged survey filing and a canceled supply order, both proved considerably less loyal under formal questioning than Coldwell had ever had reason to expect. And by the following winter there was a warrant with Coldwell's name on it, in 2 separate territories, and nobody in Larkspur County had seen him in over a year. He wasn't ruined entirely, a man with his resources rarely was, and Odessa had never expected otherwise. But he was diminished, thoroughly and publicly, in the one way a man like that could least afford. Everything he'd built rested on the appearance of inevitability, on people believing his will simply could not be opposed. That appearance had taken a wound in front of half a county, and wounds like that didn't close easily, whatever a bank balance still said underneath them. When Sharp came back to the county the following spring, thinner, quieter, carrying himself like a man still working out how to stand up straight under everything he'd done, it was Odessa who offered him work at Broken Spur, before he'd even finished asking whether there might be any to spare. You'll earn it back slow, she told him, plain as she told most people most things. Nobody here's going to pretend that debt's already settled just because the courts are through with you. But slow is still forward, Mr. Sharp, and forward's a great deal more than most men in your position get offered twice. He earned it. Slowly, exactly as she'd promised. By the second autumn, Ambrose had started trusting him with the fence crew, without needing to check the work twice behind him, which from Ambrose was very nearly a medal of honor. Josephine Merrick didn't return to clerking. She stayed on a while at Broken Spur, helping Odessa with the ledgers and the correspondence that came, increasingly, from ranchers around the territory who'd heard what one widow and one careful lawyer had managed to accomplish in a single extraordinary morning at auction, and wanted advice of their own. By the following year she'd started her own small bookkeeping practice in Larkspur, respectable and entirely her own, and she wrote Odessa letters twice a month that Odessa answered without fail, because some debts, she'd come to understand, were worth carrying forward rather than settling once and closing the book on. The sign went up at the gate the following spring. Once the worst of winter had broken enough to work outdoors comfortably, Jubal did the lettering himself, having discovered, somewhere in the previous difficult year, a steadier hand than anyone including Jubal had ever suspected he possessed. Broken Spur Ranch, Thorn and Vance. The E's a touch wide, Jubal said, standing back to study his own work with the particular critical eye of a man checking whether he'd achieved what he'd set out to achieve. Nobody's going to notice that, Micah said, his shoulder fully healed now, his arm swinging easy at his side the way it hadn't in months. I'll notice it. Then don't look at it, Micah said, which wasn't especially helpful, but also wasn't wrong. Odessa looked at the sign a long moment from the road. The way a person looks at something that marks a genuine shift in what's real. Not sentimental about it, exactly. Just taking it in fully, the way she took in most things worth taking in. It's good, she told Jubal, and he accepted that with a nod he tried hard to make casual and didn't entirely succeed at. Ranchers started arriving that same spring, the way word travels in cattle country, through buyers at auction, through hands who moved between outfits, through the plain practical network of people who paid close attention to which operations were consistently turning out healthy, well-managed herds. A young man rode up from 2 counties over that first April, 26 years old, and visibly nervous about whether he was about to lose land. His family had held 3 generations, having heard that someone at Broken Spur had turned an impossible situation around and wanted to understand exactly how. Odessa sat with him a full afternoon at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd once heard her own life reduced to cold, cruel arithmetic in a stranger's careful handwriting, and answered every question he had, including the ones that weren't especially good questions, because good questions were something a person grew into, not something they arrived already possessing. I didn't expect, the young man said, when he finally rose to leave, working to find the end of a sentence he clearly hadn't planned all the way through. I heard folks talk about the woman at Broken Spur, and I suppose I didn't expect. What? Odessa asked, not sharply, simply direct, the way she was direct about most things. Someone older, I think. He said it honestly, more an admission of his own foolishness than any kind of insult. I'm sorry, that was a poor thing to expect. How old are you? She asked. 26. Ask me again in 30 years, Odessa said, whether younger is better. See what you make of the answer then. He laughed, surprised by it, and rode out with more than he'd arrived carrying, and came back the following spring with considerably better questions. He wasn't the last. Others came after him that year, and the ones that followed a widow from up near the Montana line who'd heard the same story secondhand and wanted to know if it was really true, a father and his 2 grown sons whose herd had been struggling since a bad winter took half their stock, a young woman not yet 20 who simply wanted to learn the trade properly before anyone had the chance to tell her she couldn't. Odessa made time for all of them, the same unhurried, honest attention she'd once given a stranger's kitchen ledger on her very first morning at Broken Spur, and never once made it feel like charity, because it wasn't. It was simply what she knew, put to use on whoever needed it next. On a morning in early October, 1 full year after a train had come 11 minutes late, Larkspur Junction, Odessa walked out to the road in front of the ranch house before the light was fully up, the way she still did. Some mornings when the work could wait 20 minutes, and the valley lay quiet enough to hear the whole of it breathing. The sign at the gate caught the first thin light. Broken Spur Ranch, Thorn and Vance, Jubal's slightly wide E, still there for anyone looking closely enough to find it. Caleb came out from the barn and found her standing there, and walked up without asking why, and stood beside her, the way he'd learned to do over the past year, present without needing an explanation for the presence. Far off, they could hear the morning train, working its way up the canyon toward Larkspur Junction, carrying whoever was arriving and whoever was leaving, indifferent, the way trains always were, to what any of it might mean to the people riding inside. Someone's stepping off that train right now, Odessa said, certain they already know how their story's going to go. Usually they don't, Caleb said. No. She was quiet a moment, watching the distant tree line where the rail cut through the valley. But that was never the tragedy people make it out to be. Not knowing. She looked at the sign, at the framed tag hanging inside near the east window, where the light found it first each morning, at everything the past year had built out of a single word somebody had written down, believing it was the whole truth of her. I stepped off that train with 1 trunk, $40, and a piece of paper telling me exactly what I was worth, and the man who wrote it was certain he had it right. He was wrong about all of it, Caleb said. He was. She turned to look at him. 3 things in the end. He was wrong about the tag, wrong about the woman, wrong about what this land could still become, in the right hands, given enough time and enough people willing to stand beside each other through the worst. Caleb said nothing for a moment, Thinking of a February storm in Kansas he'd never witnessed and would carry the weight of anyway. Thinking of a barn burning in the dark and a young man's shoulder breaking to save a herd of calves. Thinking of a lawyer's careful, patient case and a clerk's shaking hands, holding up a single sheet of paper in front of half a county. The tag was never about you, he said finally. Not really. She looked at him. It was about what he needed to believe, Caleb said, to keep telling himself the world worked the way he wanted it to work. Men like that. It's never really the person they're trying to diminish. It's the story they're desperate to protect about themselves. The tag was for him, Odessa. It was never for you. She considered that a long moment, the way she considered most things, honestly, without hurry. That's generous, she said. It's accurate. She looked back at the sign, then at the mountains standing their same indifferent watch they'd kept over this valley, since long before either of their names had ever been carried into it, then at the gate where the road turned from public ground onto land that was now, undeniably, entirely her own as much as his. I'm going to check the south fence this morning, she said. Ground's been soft near the creek again. I'll send Jubal, I'll go myself. I want to look at the calf weights before I come back. She walked back toward the barn, and Caleb stood at the road a while longer, listening to the train fade south through the valley, leaving behind it the ordinary quiet of a Wyoming morning, the wind moving off the ridge, the distant cattle, the faint creak of a sign set deep enough in the ground to hold against whatever weather still had coming. He went back to work. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Not because everything had resolved without cost, or because a hard year had been fully erased by a good one that followed it, or because cruelty always produces its own tidy correction. It doesn't. And anyone who tells you otherwise has never buried a husband in a February storm or watched a barn burn in the dark with a young man's bones breaking underneath it. But because two people had each taken what they'd survived and put it to use on ground that needed exactly that, and the ground had answered, and the herd had answered, and three hands who'd started that year as strangers had become something closer to family, and a young clerk who'd once been too frightened to speak her own name aloud in a hotel hallway now ran her own respectable business in town, and a broken man who'd once set a fire out of desperation was slowly, one season at a time, becoming someone worth trusting again. The sign at the gate meant what it said. 2 names, 1 ranch, standing where a rich man's ledger had once assumed there would be nothing left standing at all. And every visitor who noticed the small frame tag by the east window, still hanging there where the morning light found it first, got the same short answer if they asked about it, the one Odessa had settled on months back and never once needed to improve. That a person's worth is never settled in the 30 seconds. It takes a train to stop and a stranger to step down from it. That the people most certain of their own ability to judge a life at a glance are, more often than not, the ones who understand the least of what they're looking at. And that the work itself steady, unglamorous, done one difficult morning at a time answers every careless word ever written about what a person is or isn't worth, and answers it in the only language that can never be argued with afterward. The language of what actually happened. What actually happened was broken spur, whole and standing. What actually happened was Odessa Vance, who arrived with 1 trunk, 1 tag, and $40, and stayed.